Staff, you ready to rock and roll?
We're ready.
Okay, just as we fold into the 5 o'clock hour, I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. First open session of the Fillmore Piru Basin GSA is now in session. Oh no, we don't have Director Long's American flag. So let's see. Think about an imaginary American flag in your mind. Let's see, Director Pace, would you like to lead us in this one? I think Director Kimball did last time.
Absolutely. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Director's roll call. And I'm pleased to call first our newest member, Christina, Director Villaseñor. What is the correct pronunciation?
It's Villaseñor.
Villaseñor. Okay, easy enough. Okay, Commissioner
Okay.
our Director Villaseñor.
Here.
Very good. Director Pace. I know he's here. Director Kimball.
Here.
Okay, Director Long will be with us later, and Director McFadden is here, and Director Minigan is occupied with more important matters. Okay, we'll move on to item 1C, public comments. I see there are quite a few people that may want to have something to say. Are there any public comments at this time? All right, we'll move on to item 1D, approval of agenda. Are there any corrections, changes, or anything else anybody wants to do to tonight's agenda?
Vice Chair McFadden, no, there are no changes proposed by staff.
Okay, very good. I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda as presented by staff.
I'll make that motion.
Right, motion by Director Pace. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second that motion.
There we go. Got you on the minutes.
All right.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye, or excuse me, do we need to do a roll call, Eva?
Yes, yes, you do.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair, Chair Longson here. Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor,
Yes.
Okay. That's
motion
Looks
carries 4-0.
sorry to interrupt you, Eva. Anybody opposed?
Nope, not that I can see.
The motion passes. We'll go on to item 2A, Director announcements. Fillmore Pumpers.
So the Fillmore Pumpers Association Board of Directors had their monthly meeting last Tuesday, January 12th. The only thing really to report is we're waiting for the imminent release of the technical memo on subsidence so that we can be well informed to prepare a straw man for discussion on the sustainable management criteria for subsidence. And I think that's all that was of significance.
Okay, Director Pace, Piru Pumpers.
Basically the same as Director Kimball. So we were in the same meeting, and that's probably all that we have kind of new to report at this point.
Okay, environmental stakeholders, and here's City of Fillmore, our brand new member. And would you like us, this will be kind of awkward, but we can go around and kind of introduce ourselves if you'd like.
Actually, I would really appreciate that. That would be wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ed McFadden. I'm the vice chair, holding on for Director Long, Chair Long until she gets here. I farm in Fillmore and represent the United Water Conservation District. Hey, there she is.
It's here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Long, Ventura County Supervisor. I am finishing up my EDC meeting, which I'm chair of, and I really appreciate Ed following in, but I'm in so I can transfer. So, and vote if you need me. So I'm here, but I'm gonna let Ed keep going.
Got it.
All right. Thank you,
Okay.
Director McFadden.
All right. Let's see. Eva, I'll just kind of go around the screen here and call out names.
Oh, okay, perfect. I'm Eva Ibarra and I'm clerk of the board.
Okay. Tony Emmerich.
Tony Emmert, I'm the executive director. My sort of part-time job and daytime job is assistant general manager with United Water Conservation District.
Okay, then on my screen, Steve O'Neill. I think you already introduced yourself, but
Good evening again, Director Villasenor. I'm Stephen O'Neill. I'm general counsel for the agency.
okay, Gordon, you want to do the next?
Yeah, Christina, my name is Gordon Kimball, and I serve as a director nominated by the Fillmore Basin Pumpers Association. My family and I grow avocados in Timber Canyon between Santa Fe and Fillmore.
Okay, Director
Thanks,
Pace.
Gordon.
My name's Glenn Pace, and I live in Fillmore, but my family operates and owns Waring Water for the town of Piru. So I represent the Piru Basin Pumpers, and then also represent Waring Water, which I'm the president of.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Glenn.
Thank you. Tony Morgan, you want to go next?
Sure. Evening, Director. Nice to have you here with us. I'm Tony Morgan. I'm with Daniel B. Stevenson Associates. We're the consultants that are preparing the groundwater sustainability plan.
Thank you.
Patrick, you're up.
Nice to meet you, Director. I work at Daniel B. Stevens with Tony Morgan and helping communicate the technical information. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks, Patrick.
Well, the best seat in town looking at your background. Okay, Lisa.
Good evening. Nice to meet you. My name is Lisa Ballin. I am with Sacramento State's Collaboration and Consensus Program. We are a subconsultant to the DBSNA team working on stakeholder engagement.
Great. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, I see we've got a few other staff from United Water who I think you should meet digitally at least. Dr. Sung.
Oh, hi, I'm the staff with United Water and I'm the groundwater modeler. So I did a lot of model simulation for your GSA. Thank you.
Dan, I see you up there. Dan Detmer.
Hi, good evening. Dan Detmer, supervising hydrogeologist with United Water Conservation District. I'm helping coordinate our support for the agency.
Thank you.
Okay, and I see Zachary Plummer in the background, keeping us all straight and making sure that, well, let's see, who else do we have here from United? Somebody else popped on, Zach.
We have Zach Hansen.
Yep, I'm Zach Hansen. I'm with United Water. I'm groundwater modeling hydrogeologist and supporting the efforts in the basins.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Okay, did I miss anybody from United?
There's Embry. Embry's online.
Okay, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Oh, hi, I'm Ambry Tibet. I'm the senior accountant at United, and I'm also the accountant for GSA, Fillmore and Piru GSA. So managing on Basin too.
Okay, thanks, Amber. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much. Eva, Tony, did I miss anybody else? I can't see everybody.
Anybody else that's on?
I think we have everybody.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say, Tony, do you want to introduce Kristen Broderick, who's also on the DBSNA team?
Yes, Christian, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, Good evening. My name is Christian Broderick. I work for Stillwater Sciences in Berkeley, California, and we're leading the groundwater dependent ecosystem assessment.
Great, thank you. Nice to meet you, Christian.
Okay, very good. Let's see, moving on to director announcements, United Water Conservation District, that's me. I don't really have anything to add. I think Kelly is still tied up. She wants to chime in with something.
Hi, this is Kelly. I just wanted to let you know, just in regards to the Santa Clara River watershed, we're going to be having our meeting that's coming through. So look for the email. Oh my gosh, this is funny. Also, just to make sure everyone's looking, keep your social distance in COVID as we're doing the water. AWA had a great water talk today and talked about La Nina. They had a special guest that we do every year, speaking about the weather and water as it comes. And it looks like it's going to be a hotter year and not as much water. So I believe that it was recorded. So if you have a chance, you can go on the AWA site and review that. That'll be important because they're looking at maybe a drier year for the next 2 years. And as we know with water, that's important for us. So that's the update I have right now. Thank you.
Eric Boltgave gave good presentations this morning at AWA. All right, item 2B, Executive Director update.
Good evening. I do have a few things. I'm happy to report that the receivables list is headed in the right direction. So regarding groundwater fees that are still outstanding, we're down to a little over 37,000. If you recall, a couple months ago, we were up at the 57,000 mark, and we've got stuff we have to spend money on in the near future. So that's headed in the positive direction. We still have about a couple grant invoice payments that we're expecting reimbursement from DWR in the near future. Both of those were approved, but they haven't come in yet. So cash flow is looking a little bit better. Speaking of the grant, we've completed a grant quarter, and so Ambry's team, as well as the technical team, will be preparing a quarterly grant report and an invoice. So that's amazingly enough, it's report 7 and invoice number 7 already, and that will be submitted before February 15th. Regarding the groundwater model, United staff, many of whom are present, have been busy working in support of this GSA and the Mound Basin GSA and others. We set a target for having documentation on the model or draft documentation ready for review by the end of January. And it's highly likely that's going to be a couple of weeks later because the same staff that was working on the documentation set that aside and paused that effort in order to get a third forward-looking model run done. So now we have the baseline, the 2030 DWR climate factors run, and then the 2070 DWR climate factors run. So that's now in the hands of our consultant, and you may see some of the results of that. The same group has been working to try to support the Mound Basin downriver. So we are still expecting the documentation draft to be completed, but it'll probably be more, more like the mid-February instead of the end of January. Just a reminder that for all of us that have to do the California Fair Political Practices end of year statements or taking office statements or leaving office statements, I believe that Director Holmgren was confirmed to have completed his, and he completed his service at the end of the year, but but we all have those coming up, and just as a reminder, those do go to the clerk of the county board, and Eva can help with that, facilitate that, but she put that on my list to remind all of us that have to do those, including myself. So so we got those coming up, and then I don't have an item on this board agenda, but we are working on putting something together for your consideration that would allow staff to approve small requests like waiver of late fees and penalties. I believe it was last month we had 4 of those on there, and they ranged from everything from $12.72 up to a couple $100s. And so so we have a draft that we're working on, but don't have that for you tonight. We'll shoot for trying to get that to your board in February. And legal counsel will talk a little bit more next about his findings regarding working with some of the tools that the county has. And so we also have on our work list a receivables collection program that may take us a little bit longer. And then we do have presentations in the future as time allows. You had asked for an update on the Newhall Ranch project status that's going along, and also the Santa Clarita Valley Sanitation District chloride removal project. So those are both in the hopper, but we don't have those tonight. We'll try to get those scheduled in the near future. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, we'll move on to item 2C, legal counsel update. Steve, what do you have for us?
Thank you, Mr. Director McFadden. I wanted to report that just, I worked a little bit with Tony on the kind of a waiver or write-off policy that we hope to bring back in February. But you may recall from the last meeting, I was tasked with running to ground this issue with trying to get county council to allow the GSA to place any delinquencies in fees on a property owner's tax roll. And for Director Villasenor, for some background, this agency has statutory power to levy fees as part of its groundwater sustainability plan implementation. And there's a whole set of statutes that govern that. And basically the act allows us to collect delinquent fees in several ways, because the board was discussing if we have a lot of delinquencies, how we could enforce those delinquencies and get paid. And under the act, a GSA can collect delinquent fees in several ways. Number one, by bringing a suit, by filing a lawsuit. Number two, by ordering a pumper to cease pumping, to cease extracting groundwater. Or number three, in the manner in which the county collects delinquent assessments, water charges, or tolls. And so we've been doing some work, legal work on this, researching relevant statutes, and ultimately engaging with the county counsel's office to try and convince them that one of our a potential delinquency on a fee payment to the GSA could be put on the tax rolls. And the short answer is they disagree, and we don't think we're going to get them to do that. And the analysis was that working with the county council, we reviewed a series of statutes together that discuss the ability to have fees and certain fees for tolls or tolls for services and facilities put on the tax roll, but they really only apply to certain agencies, which the GSA is not, specifically sanitation districts. We then started exploring the county code, the county's ordinances for circumstances in which the county would put a penalty or a fine or delinquency on the tax roll, and it comes up in two places, for nuisance abatement and for abandoned vehicles. If the county is trying to levy a fee for a nuisance abatement and is not paid, after some due process, the county puts it on the tax roll. A similar thing for abandoned vehicles. However, the county council did not find our argument persuasive in that the corollary we were trying to draw between those scenarios that are identified in the county code, he did not think that those fell within the authorization under our statutes regarding the collection of delinquent assessments, water charges, or tolls. So based on that, that conclusion, we don't think we're going to be able to use the tax roll as a method to collect any delinquencies, which brings us to the situation that if we are in a position where we want to collect delinquencies, I think we're going to have to either file suit or get an order to cease groundwater extraction. And that concludes my report on this matter. And I'm of course happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for that background information. Has there been research with other GSAs and how they've dealt with this issue, this problem?
No, I have. We represent several different. My firm represents other GSAs, and
right.
It's so in its nascent or early stages that it hasn't really kind of hit the screen yet. In a sense, no one's really had to do that. This agency is being a little forward thinking and proactive in anticipating this, but we haven't had any experience with that yet, but we soon may. My partner represents an agency up in the Indian Wells Valley up by China Lake and Ridgecrest, and they have extraction fees that are very high. But we'll see if there are delinquencies in that area, and we'll see what happens there. But right now, I think, as Tony reported, we're pretty good in terms of our delinquencies, but it's something we really want to keep an eye on, and especially when after the GSP is completed and the full implementation starts. That's where we might see this issue arise.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Okay, anything else, Steve?
Yeah, if I could ask Steve or make a comment. One, Christina, our assessment is $12 an acre foot. We originally started at 9, but because we had a little fumble in terms of when we could actually impose fees, we had to give about 9 months, return 9 months or credit 9 months fees. And so it meant we had to raise our fee. The Indian Wells current extraction fee is?
Somewhere around 1,200, I think, or it's really, really high.
Yeah,
they have
$1,200 an acre foot.
Yeah, it's really, really high. And it's the basins in way overdrafted. There's very little natural recharge. And, there's a big, evidently there's a big pistachio grower up there now who is actually filed a lawsuit over this. So that's something else we have to keep an eye on.
Okay, any other questions? Chair Long, are you back?
I am back. Thank you.
All right, I'll hand off.
I love being able to rely on you, Ed. Thank you so much. Okay, so that we're at GSP consultant update. Is that correct? Okay, so we have Tony Morgan.
We are.
He'll get his screen up.
One moment, please.
You're always good for a PowerPoint.
Well, let's see, we're having a little hard technical issue here. Well, I'm going to keep talking while I'm fiddling with the screen here. So we've got a couple of agenda items tonight of significant merit, I think, for the board to hear about. So there's the monitoring well project update that's coming along. And so we're going to give you an update. That's item 4B, as I recall. And then we're going to continue our discussion of sustainable management criteria under item 4C. And in that item, we're going to have a presentation on that deals primarily with the 2070 climate change modeling effort. And so we're going to take a look at that. So let's see what's going on here with, there we go. So I thought it was appropriate to touch base on the overall project schedule as we have it right now. We had hoped to have the subsidence technical memorandum in your hands before this evening's meeting. But as we were using it to process some of the 2070 climate change data, we recognized some kind of strange output from it, reached back to the Texas Water Development Board, who is the folks who sponsored the preparation of this screening tool. They saw what we saw. They shoved us off to their consultant that prepared that document, and they've identified that they think they have a bug in their spreadsheet screening tool. And so they're churning on that, and we're going to look and see what that potential fix looks like. In the meantime, we've got another alternative approach for addressing that. So hopefully this will be in your hands well before next month's meeting, so you have an opportunity to take a look at it. So apologize for that delay, but better we find the bug now than later. GDEs are being worked on by Stillwater. That's in the hopper and coming. You heard from Mr. Emmert on the groundwater model documentation, and all of these things that you see here as the technical memos, those kind of all get bundled up when we start talking about the sustainable management criteria and the part of the conversation we're going to have this evening. And then that will lead us into project management, projects and management actions if so deemed appropriate. Our goal is still latter part of May, aiming for a public review draft of the GSP. So that does mean that we're going to need to be making some decisions on sustainable management criteria in the very near future so that we can begin to assemble that document. We've got a little bit of room. If we needed to push that out a month, we could probably get away with that because we do have some time built in under the public review update draft. We may not need that much time, but I put it in there to be safe. So if we don't need that much time, we might have another 4 weeks or so. We could push this, but much beyond that, that's going to be the limit of where we can go. So questions about the schedule?
Nope.
All good?
Tony,
Anything
all right,
else?
very good. That's all from me on this topic.
one question or suggestion. If that's a handy
Yes, sir.
document to refer to, might be good just to have it as part of the high resolution part of the presentation that we can print out. Sometimes I make fuzzy copies or fuzzy printouts from.
What I'll do is in the future, I'll try to put the schedule in there as a full page document. That way it'd be easier to print and read, I think.
Yeah.
Would that be helpful?
Need a piece of paper I can scribble. That'll be good.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
So Tony,
right.
this is,
Any other-
I have just a question. This is Glenn.
Hey, Glenn.
So looking at the schedule, so we don't have any more workshops until after the draft GSP is prepared, correct?
That is currently the way it looks. We have the option, if needed, to have another stakeholder workshop on the sustainable management criteria. If you recall, last month we talked about that and decided we weren't really ready to have that workshop yet. We needed to get a little further down the road with the board. And so if that's something that needs to come about in early March or something like that, that's certainly doable. So we took that workshop off the schedule because we don't have a time for it yet, or a date for it. Yeah, they should say.
Okay. I'd say just as a general comment, and I think you're probably feeling this, we're all feeling this, is it just seems like every month these are slipping. And I think we're going to be in trouble to try to wrap up and write up and comment and do everything if we can't get these technical memos. I know we're going to, from the Pumpers Association, we're waiting for the subsidence technical memo so that we can have our input on it. I assume that the environmentalists are doing kind of the similar type things, and so all the environmental stakeholders. So all in all, I think that's going to be a challenge. Is there any way to get these wrapped up sooner or expedite any of these technical memos, the subsidence GDEs and groundwater model stuff? We saw that slip in a couple of weeks, if I understand that right, the documentation. So I just, the urgency, I guess, for everybody is having those technical memos that we can review and give input on.
Right, I understand that. Yeah, makes sense that you want to be able to see those and have the opportunity to comment in advance of the preparation of the public review draft. Again, the subsidence one, we had hoped to have that to you, but again, I'd rather hold that back and try to fix the bug that was there before giving it to you than having to retract it and start over again. So I think that was the appropriate path to take on that one. The other documents are I mean, they're moving along. I don't know that there's much of a way to expedite them any more than what they already are. We got the 2070 and 2030 climate change modeling results a couple of weeks ago or so. And so we've been churning through those, extracting the information we need on that. So it's a multi-cog machine that's coming together now, where modeling results are becoming available, and then we'll be able to look at those and process those and try to interpret what they mean, then synthesize that data down into a presentation for the board to take a look at before we move forward with a technical memo. So for example, we're not going to start the technical memo on sustainable management criteria until we get some consensus from the board as to what that might look like, and the stakeholders have an opportunity to see that. We'll have ideas, obviously, and have straw men prepared, of course, but preparing that document in particular is going to have to wait until we get some consensus from the board as the starting point.
Right, and we as at least from the pumpers, we can't give the input related to subsidence until we have the technical memo till we can do that. And so as those are compressing together, that's making that more challenging.
Yeah,
okay.
Understood. That's part of that multi-cogged machine, trying to get all the gears to mesh.
Right.
And thank you for bringing that up. We also have a question, and Tony, if you could just repeat it. Both Fillmore and Piru plans are due at the same time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
We
had that question in the chat box. I wanted to make sure we answered.
Yes, they are on the same timeline per DWR's requirement.
Okay. Any other questions? And seeing or hearing none, thank you for the GSP update. We'll move on to the consent calendar. We have 3 items, which is the approval of the minutes, approval of the warrants, and the monthly financial report. Are there any discussion on that item, or could I receive a motion to approve from one of our directors?
I have a correction to the minutes.
Great.
On let's see, page 8 of this agenda, or page 4 of the minutes, it shows that I voted no on approval of the consent calendar in December. I think I actually voted yes, but I was fumbling trying to get unmuted, and by the time I got unmuted, it had moved on. So I had no reason to vote no on that. So if you'd correct that, Eva, please.
Okay, we'll get that correction. Eva, you've got that modification? Okay. So with that, if there aren't any further, I would ask to approve as recommended with that modification to the minutes.
Make that motion.
Thank you, Director McFadden. And can I get a second?
I'll second.
It'll be a second is Director Pace. Any other discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any noes?
Do we need a roll call? Sorry.
I'm sorry, I was muted again. Yes, this is under the Brown Act. We still need, because it's telephonic, the governor hasn't excused the roll call provision, so we do need a roll call on the vote.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Every board seems to be doing it differently lately. So roll call, please, Eva. Thank you.
Director Kimball?
Aye.
Okay. Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden, Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villasenor,
Yes.
All right, motion is approved. Thank you very much. The next item is item 4A. Our request for a payment plan and waiver for the late fees and interest. Tony?
Chair Long, this is a request from Bartolotto and Ray Fogel requesting a payment plan. They have about 10 or 11 acres, and due to COVID, they essentially had no ability to sell their crop this year. And so they have requested deferment of that balance of $263.64, and have worked with staff to put together a payment plan for 3 payments of $87.88 beginning on May 1st. And their intention would be to have that past due balance paid by the July 1st, 2021 date. And if they make that payment and they are current on their new pump charges, so that would be the pumping that ended December 31st, 2020. So both the payment plan and the new payment, assuming that they can sell a crop, then staff would be supportive of the agency waiving the penalties and interest, which aren't too much. I don't know if we have that listed there of what the exact number, but it's a relatively small interest penalty. So staff is recommending that the agency do consider the payment plan, and if they're able to make their payments by that July 1st time, then the board would authorize staff to waive the interest and penalty.
Okay. Any discussions on this item from our directors?
Just I've got a question for Tony. Is pumping ongoing by that operation?
It's my understanding that pumping is ongoing. Embry, do you have any additional information on that?
Unfortunately, I don't have additional information. I can confirm that with Sarah tomorrow morning and get back to you.
Okay. It's my understanding that pumping is going on and that they're intending to be able to sell a crop in the springtime.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, can I get a motion to approve as recommended?
I'll make that motion to approve as recommended.
Thank you so much. And a second, please.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. It's been first and second. Any further discussion? Roll call, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Villasenor,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
yeah.
All right, motion is approved. Thank you very much. Moving on to the monitoring wells project. We're going to update from United and the Tonys.
Chair Long, Zach Hansen will be providing an update on the proposed locations, and Tony Morgan's team will be providing an update on the project schedule and cost estimates.
Okay. Are you pulling up a screen?
Zach there?
You there, Zach?
I think we had a disconnect here. I thought Eric Elliott was going to do this. Zach's not prepared to do that. And I'm not sure
sorry.
Eric's here.
I was looking at Zach's name and it is actually Eric Elliott. My
Oh, there you
apologies.
go. Is Eric on?
I'm not sure Eric's with us. I can take a crack at it.
Okay, go Dan.
Somebody had the presentation. I know we submitted that draft. I don't know what became of it. Can we arrange the order perhaps and see if we can get this figured out?
You want to come back?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay, let's come back to this one. We'll move on to 4C, sustainable management criteria. We'll give that one to Tony and then we'll come back to the wells. Thank you, Dan.
All right, let me swap out.
While you're swapping out, did Ed, did you talk about Commissioner Minigan not being here and why?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, you should see a screen.
Yes.
I hope. All right, good. We're going to spend a good deal of time talking about the 2070 climate change scenario. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we got some information from United showing us anticipated pumping and response to pumping in the basins. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to use that information to talk about surface water depletion as well as groundwater pumping and kind of go through that stream flow crossover analysis that we did in past months. So I think to start off this, it would probably be helpful if I could ask Dan Detmer to give us a quick rundown of what was done to create the 27 climate change scenario. So I know you're juggling one presentation while I'm asking you to jump in on something else, Dan. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We've talked a fair bit about our historical modeling. We've described how we've mapped the aquifers in these basins, how we have used our historic stream flow, rainfall, and water level records to calibrate our new groundwater flow model. So that was our 35-year historic period where we relied on existing records to build a numerical groundwater flow model that attempts to replicate those water levels based on the pumping extractions and the recharge elements from rainfall and stream flow. And we did a good job with that. The calibration is quite good for a regional model like this one. And now with the application of that model, we want to do forecasting. So we shift into a very different mode here where we have to make an awful lot of assumptions and forecast if our basins are going to be sustainable in the future. And so briefly, I'll detail what that process is like. The first thing we had to do was choose a climatic period, and we chose a 77-year climate period from 1943 through 2019. So that period of 77 years had an average rainfall very similar to the long-term average, and also had some of the wettest and driest periods that we have on record in this in the project area here. So we don't expect that rainfall record to be predictive, so it's not going to happen the same way as it happened in the past, but we think it captures the range of likely occurrence of rainfall and stream flow. Now, DWR requires that we apply certain climate factors to those historic records. So we expect the storm patterns to be a little bit different. Overall, things will be a little bit drier here. So we have a 2030 climate change factors that are prescribed for both rainfall and stream flow, and a 2070 climate factors that are described for both stream flow and rainfall. And so when we're talking, Tony will be talking about these runs later this evening, and the 2070 climate factor is that climate change over time that we can expect over the next, between now and over the next 50 years to 2070. So that worked pretty, that was the watersheds, the significant watersheds that feed the Piru and Fillmore basins are largely in a natural state. And so we took those climate factors and scaled the stream flow for the future periods. And we scaled the rainfall for the future periods for our recharge element on land precipitation. Now in LA County, we had additional considerations. We have future discharges from the treatment plants. That's a major source of recharge to the Piru Basin and in turn the Fillmore Basin. So we relied on our neighboring agency, the Santa Clarita Valley's forecasting for what's going to happen with air pumping and development and discharges to the stream flows. We also had significant urban development in the Santa Clarita Valley. So based on population changes between 1940 through 2005, we used the County of Ventura's flood flow model, overland flow model, to assess if that urbanization has had a large influence on surface water runoff. And when we compared the urbanization from recent times to historic times, we did see big changes in the forecasted runoff. It's much flashier, and we get less recharge in Santa Clarita Valley and more runoff to the Piru Basin. And so we went through an exercise where every 20 years we scaled that urban development based on population records from the census data. And so have not only forecasted different changes in naturally occurring rainfall and runoff, but land use patterns upstream of us that's basically correcting the historic record from the native as that area changed from native lands to urban areas. Because as we go now forecast in the future, we have a bunch of development that we didn't have in the early portion in those 1940s in the historic record. So we're correcting those rainfall projections forward. And then in these baseline runs, as far as the extractions are concerned, we had conversations with the cities, the municipal pumpers, and the growers about how they expect their land use to change, if their cropping patterns are going to change significantly, if their water use in particular is going to change significantly. So we've these baseline runs take those assumptions for future land use and pumping and incorporate the future climate elements. And those are the runs that you'll be seeing presented here from by Tony. So this is part of the documentation we've been talking about. So we're not only writing up our historical model construction and our validation period and update period, where we went from our 31 years to our 35 years, but also all these future forecasting elements. And we need everybody to understand the process, and we are in a hurry to get this documentation into people's hands so they can see what we've done in more detail than just a brief narrative like this. But again, you know, these are examples, and we don't expect rainfall to come like it did in that same period. So we have a 20-year period by which we need to demonstrate sustainable conditions. But that's not to say we're looking at the 1944 through 1963 rainfall, and whatever happened in 1963 was going to happen in 2040. So I just want to emphasize that point again, as we have in the past. Are there other elements I should talk about, Tony?
That's enough to get us going, Dan. Thank you.
Sure.
Gets everybody oriented a little bit. And so as Dan was talking there, I put the first of the technical slides up there on the screen. And what you're looking at is a lot of information crammed on one slide. So let's walk through that just very quickly. So the blue bars you see right here are precipitation every year from 1986 and then continuing out through the future model period out to 2096. And so you remember Dan said that we took a past climate period. We started in 1943 and went forward and basically appended that on to our climate record, our precipitation record. So we come out here to 2019, and this is current where we started. And so we append 1943 onto that and then keep on going. So this is basically the historic equivalent for this year is 1943.
Tony, I'm not seeing
everybody?
your screen. I'm not seeing your screen shared. Is anybody else?
I am.
Yeah, I can see it.
I do see it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Maybe it's your view, Tony.
Yeah, I'll change it. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries. So this historical equivalent date graph here just picks out a few times along there so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on, and I'll explain this a little bit more in a moment. So the blue bars represent the precipitation. The blue dashed line here is the 5-year moving average of precipitation. So you kind of get an idea of the trends of increasing and decreasing of precipitation. The solid black line there representing the long-term average for this period that we see illustrated in this slide. So the rather prominent red curve here that you see is the cumulative departure from mean. What does that mean? It means that we're summing up the departure from mean for every single water year. Okay, we're summing them up. And so the way you interpret this kind of graph is if this curve is going down, that means we've got a predominance of dry years, of years below average. And so we're building up a deficit, if you will, compared to average. When we see the trend going back up, we're getting more years that are above average. And so the trend is increasing back up. And so you typically look at these things going from a wet period. Here's a nice wet period. You can see the red lines above the zero there. We go through a long dry period, and we come back up into a wet period at the end. So this just gives you the ability to look at things and say, gee, that's a long dry period. We're coming out of it and we're coming back. Now, that's looking at a multi-decadal time scale, okay? The way we often look at things is at the little bumps on top of the major curves. So we look at this period right here. We've got, this is our most recent drought right here. Here's 2011. And so we see below average, below average, below average, again, and then above. And so what we see is this line keeps getting deeper and deeper, okay? And then we get a wet year, we get a little recovery, and then we go back into a dry year, we lose a little bit, and then we get some wet years in a row. And so we begin to recover. So we look at these time periods here, and we see what this trend can look like. So it's interesting for us to take a look at the corresponding years. So for example, 2005 was a wet year. And you saw that from some of the air photos that we looked at last month. And so here's 2005. And if we look at the analogous year in the future, here it is. It's out here. Okay, this is the mid-1940s 7-year drought period. Okay, and so that's driving some of our water level declines that we see here. We came off a little bit of a wetter than average period. We got a little bump, and now we're dropping back down following this reproduction of the 1940s 7-year drought. I'm going to emphasize again what Dan mentioned to us. This isn't predictive. This doesn't mean that in 2021, we're going to start having wet years and then 7 years of dry right after it. That's not what this means. Okay, it is not predictive, but it's a way for us to get an idea of what might the mins, max, the extremes, the durations of wet and dry periods might look like in the future by taking a look at the historical record and then replicating that and adding DWR's climate change factors on top of that. Okay, so if you think there's a climate change factor associated with it, there is. Look at this 2005. That's actual data. But look at what DWR says with their climate change factor. That same analogous year, okay, has an estimated higher precipitation amount. Now, interestingly enough, if this is at all based in reality, then a 40-inch year becomes a 50-inch precipitation year. And if we thought we had a lot of water with 40 inches of rain, wait till we have 50 on to add to that mix. That'll be an interesting year. So again, these are not predictive. This is just to give us an idea of what the ranges of trends might look like. And so we could have picked multiple years to start. We could have started with 1958 or whatever time point we wanted in history and appended that to 2020 and went forward. But we looked at things like trying to minimize the difference between the historical record and the future record, minimizing and making sure our cumulative departures from mean looked reasonable and weren't really out of whack. So there's a lot of educated guesstimates that go into producing this future climate patterning here, this precipitation record that we use to run the groundwater flow model for the 2070 climate change factors, and then also to extract information out of it to inform the board about the GSP process. Questions on this? I'm going to show you the Fillmore Basin slide next. It looks very much the same and we won't spend this much time on it. But if there are questions about this now, this slide, because I know it's a complicated slide.
Got a quick question.
There's
Tony.
a question in the chat. Sorry.
Go ahead, Ed, and then we'll do the chat question for after.
Okay, Tony, on the I'm looking at the red cumulative departure line there. How do we relate that to what the actual basin water levels were during those periods?
You don't.
Is there a correlation?
Yeah, you don't. In general, yes, there's a semi-quantitative correlation, but we'll take a look at that in a moment at a few wells and talk about what this looks like in the future.
Okay.
From the model scenarios. We have some examples for you. Patrick's going to take you through.
Okay, Lisa, you want to do the one in the chat?
Sure. There's two questions. The first one, is there a way we could include a trend line to the cumulative mean?
Could we? Yes. Not right at the moment, but
would
yes.
That be, yeah. Okay. Would that be useful?
Maybe.
In your opinion?
Maybe. I mean, I don't look at this thing to give me quantitative type information. I look at this to say, are we in a long-term drought, bottoming out, coming back kind of time frame? That's what I look at, and I look at water levels, and I look at surface water flows, and I try to make sure these kinds of things sort of make sense when you put them all together.
Does it?
Okay.
And the next question is there a version of the slides available somewhere? It is different than both versions emailed.
This one is different because I added on the historic equivalent data, and I think I put on the analogous years just to make it a little bit clearer, but the rest of them are the same. So it's just this slide that had an update
So
for clarity.
If we can make sure that this slide is updated to our website, that would be good.
Yeah.
No I really have a hard time with the red line.
Okay.
I understand that maybe you're just looking at the loss, but if you've got influx coming in, I'm just concerned the rules and regulations that are made from that, because they think that we're going to be in a negative 100 participation inches. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but it just, yeah, I'm not sure. I just want to make sure we understand that those data points well enough.
Kelly, Chair Long, that's why I asked the question, does that have any correlation with the actual groundwater
Yeah.
during those periods. Because
I think, go ahead, I'm sorry.
that's all. The red line looks dramatic, but whether or not it had a dramatic effect on basin levels, we don't know.
And we'll take a look at some wells to show you what that impact looks like in a few moments. Patrick's got some examples to show you from the 2070 data. So in general, again, if the line is declining, if the trend is declining, then we're getting a situation where precipitation, this is precipitation only. This isn't the amount of water that percolates. This isn't the amount of water that United releases from the lake or we get from Castaic or anything like that. This is just purely precipitation. So there are other variables that factor into what the water levels in the basin might look like. Also,
Okay.
the amount of pumping.
It's only rainfall departure then, lack of rainfall, not anything else.
It's
Because
only
you say
precipitation. Exactly. It's only, again,
you say cumulative as your red line, which is not all of the water. It's only the rainfall.
yes, it's only the cumulative precipitation departure from the mean. That's all it is. Just precipitation.
Okay.
Precipitation.
There's another question on which said, did you consider the SPI?
What SPI? Which SPI are you talking about? If I could get a little more clarification from the
Letta, that was your question. If you want to unmute your microphone, you can ask the question.
Hi, it's the standard precipitation index.
No, we did not consider the standard precipitation index. We're just using straight precipitation values.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question. Appreciate it. Are there any other questions?
Just another comment.
In the chat? Yeah.
If I look at the precipitation there, we know from experience that it doesn't take too many precipitation years over 20 inches to charge our basins up pretty fast. They recover quickly.
I think that's a good point. And if we look at things like this area right here, if you look at that trend that you see, and then look back in history and look at this trend, it's the same trend. This is the late 1980s drought, early 1990s recovery. It's the same pattern right here. So it's those years where we're above average that we see this curve recovering and going positive, the slope going positive for us. Okay, it's when we have multiple years in a row or nearly in a row, or 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, something like that, is when we start to see a dramatic recovery in the cumulative departure curve. So we really live in these basins for the years that are above average. We need above average years to keep the basins healthy.
Right, but I think your average basin quantity is based on that blue line, not the red line. So if you're talking about how the highs and lows of the basin for how much water we can take out or something, I think you would be following the dashed blue line versus your red line. That's my concern. And I'm hoping you're going to explain it a little bit more, because I'm not liking that red line.
Yeah, and Tony, my point is, we know from watching our wells that a couple of good years, things top off very quickly. So I'm just a little concerned.
That's correct.
To the examples, a little concerned that we understand and use that red line in a way that makes sense, I guess.
You're not making any decisions in the GSP based on that red curve.
Right.
It's information that we as hydro people look at when we're trying to say, why do water levels look like they're going down? Is that consistent with the mean, the cumulative departure curve? Is it going down? And if it is, then we're feeling more confident about the data that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we have a similar graph. This is the Fillmore one. It looks very, very similar. I don't think we need to belabor the point on it, but you can see that there are the same kinds of curves. The patterning is a little bit different on them, but the same kind of thing. The mean, interestingly enough, is pretty close for the two basins going forward, because we have the long-term water levels in there that are in general a little bit higher than the historical due to the change factors associated with that. Okay, so you were looking for some examples of things, and I'm going to turn this over to Patrick for the next few slides and let him show you some of the information that he's pulled out of the 2070 modeling scenario files, and give you an idea of what this means as far as water levels in a few of the wells. So I'm going to stop sharing, and Patrick, it's all yours.
Sounds good. So I'm trying to find my screen here. Sorry, usually it shows up. Okay. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen.
There we go.
Okay, excellent. All right. Good evening, directors and all attending tonight. Thanks, Tony. So Tony and I, we had a feeling you'd be a little shocked when you saw that cumulative departure curve, but hopefully over these next slides, you'll see that the basin is very resilient. What I'm showing you here on this slide is some more information about what went into the model, our assumptions. What we're looking at in this table up here in the top left is historically from 1985 to 2019, what was the average pumping rate on each basin? So in Fillmore is about almost 47,000 acre feet per year on average, and Piru is a little over 11,000 on average. And the reason I showed this graph here on the bottom right is just to kind of convey a trend that's been going on with pumping. It looks like overall, I'm sure many on the call are, could speak to why this is, but it seems like pumping has been kind of decreasing since 1985 overall. And the reason I show this is that when we came up with future pumping for the next 76 years for 2020 to 2096, we used analogous years based on the past to replicate what we think would it look like in the future. So we're gonna look at two future scenarios. One's the baseline. We're gonna call baseline as if there's no climate change. And you would expect pumping to be very similar to the past, but we were kind of surprised that, Fillmore had about a couple of thousand extra feet on average. And I just wanted to convey that it seems to be that some wells have been abandoned. So that kind of takes away about 500 acre feet per year in the Fillmore Basin. And also, I don't know, perhaps pumping's just gotten more efficient or there has been less pumping. There was a drought in the late 80s. You can see the pumping went up and receded as we got back into wet years. In the most recent drought, there's a little less pumping in Fillmore. So that kind of explains why, on average, in the future, we have a slightly lower average pumping rate. But there's quite a bit of variation. So baseline pumping values are similar to historical, but not exactly the same. So what we're really interested in is, how extreme might climate change be in the future? So we're going to focus on the 2070 results, and due to projected higher temperatures and perhaps less rainfall on average in certain years, we expect pumping to be a little higher. So it looks like about 10%, we projected about 10% higher pumping. So instead of about 45,000, we have about almost 50,000 Fillmore and about 15,000 in Piru. Just wanted to present this to provide some context that the changes in storage and the water levels that we'll be looking at on the next slide. If anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. Sometimes it's hard for me to monitor the messages.
You're good, Patrick.
Great, thank you. Okay, so what we're looking at here is time series starting from 2020, the difference between baseline pumping values in the upper graph here. The baseline is shown in black, and when you have a drought period, as we saw with that previous slide that Tony presented, this is that kind of mega looking drought. So pumping kind of is typically a little higher during this period, and then the future scenario kind of had more precipitation for several decades thereafter. and we kind of go through another drought here. So pumping is usually higher during droughts and lower during wet years. And so what this, the thing we're interested in is what is the change in basin storage, amount of water in the ground. And that's what we're looking at in the bottom graph here. And maybe not so surprising because we had shown you in the past, we did the basin stress test. What if we increased pumping, 20%, 40%, 60%, even doubled it? What we noticed in those past presentations is that groundwater levels do respond or recover pretty rapidly. So the difference, what we're seeing here between baseline, no climate change feature, and a feature with more extreme climate change, DWR's projections, is that during your droughts, you would expect greater loss in groundwater storage during droughts, but thankfully, it seems as long as you get enough wet years, you kind of recover back to what would be baseline conditions anyways. So I think many of you are familiar with these considerations we've been presenting, that it's kind of like during the droughts, it seems like what we're really worried about is how deep will water levels go, and will like certain wells perhaps go dry. So I'll show some more slides. We're going to move away from storage and start talking about groundwater levels. Before I do that, I'm just going to show you also Piru, very similar story. You have pretty significant decline in storage during the hypothetical drought, but we do get recovery. So on this slide,
I would state on that, if you go back one slide,
yeah,
that just me personally, having the red and black very similar feels much better than what we saw earlier. So I appreciate this, just in understanding the ebb and flows of the years as to what our baseline is versus 2070. This is more of what I was thinking would be. So thank you.
right. And I think that's why Tony said this isn't the cumulative departure of precipitation. Precipitation is just one input into the entire system. So that's why I believe Tony said it's not an exact correlation with groundwater levels, because there are other factors that go into consideration. So before I move on, I'll just mention that overall our goal is to start at 0 and get back to 0, like a 0 net change in storage. So we don't want to see a downward trend. We wouldn't want to see these lines to consistently go downward over time.
Since I asked the question, is there any other questions from directors or public comments?
Chair Long, I've got one comment.
Yes.
Patrick, you were showing a downward trending use line. And one comment I'll make is that just in that time period, if we look at the way that agriculture applies water, we've made dramatic changes in efficiency in the way we apply water. And you talked about abandoned wells, but I know just in my career, we've changed things drastically from the way I did things when I was a child to the way we do things now. We've gone to more efficient hardware, micro sprinklers, drip irrigation, and we're becoming more sophisticated with the way we control that and the way we monitor soil moisture. So we're much more efficient than we were a generation ago.
Thank you, Director McFadden. Yeah, I figured that was a major reason for why we're seeing this downward trend. Yeah.
Yeah. Lisa, is there any other question? Oh, sorry, Gordon, go ahead.
And I would say there's no reason not to expect the technology will improve, and we will continue, whether we can make some of these improvements in efficiency are probably from furrow irrigation, just running it down ditches, to sprinklers and micro sprinklers, and that's a pretty significant increase. I think we'll continue. I would expect as an engineer that we'll continue to see improvements. I think they'll be less dramatic in the future.
Maybe in tree crops, Gordon, they may be based on some other factors, cultural factors, such as maintaining tree height to lower levels, just different ways to more efficiently produce a crop that may have positive benefits on water use also.
Good points. Lisa, were there anything from the chat?
Yes, there's one question similar to before. Could we also see a trend line on these graphs?
I assume that's for these ones.
I think so.
Okay. We could, and if I had to draw one right now, I would probably draw it very flat. So, that's the main thing I believe we're looking after is we don't want to see chronic downward trends. And just if you were to arbitrarily fit a line through this, I believe it'd be pretty flat, but we do have to consider how often events like this occur because it could bias the trend line down. But yeah, you kind of get complicated. But yeah, we could fit a trend line, but I think the message we're getting is that things look pretty stable.
The question is how is it on average? How are we doing? Just as an estimate, I think that's the question.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. We could focus on certain time periods and how dramatic and things like that. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so now we'll move on to the next part of the slides I'm presenting. We're going to look at groundwater levels at some wells that we've looked at in the past. And I'll just kind of describe, this is a map of where the well is. We're looking at a shallow domestic well near the Fillmore Santa Paula Basin boundary, kind of near this rising groundwater zone. A little bit away from the stream, actually. But we have a lot of data historically. The measured water levels are in kind of teal or light blue kind of color dots. And as you can see, the model is this is a historical model runs, which we've shown you in the past in gray. And they match very well here at this well. So this is the kind of thing we like to see when United was building the model, that the model replicates actual measured water levels quite well. And what we're looking at after the gray line ends is when we start the future modeling. So you can see the black line is pretty hidden by the red line because as we saw the storage figures before, they're pretty similar, definitely similar trends. There's a little bit more of a kind of a deeper water levels during the droughts under the climate change scenario versus baseline. So what we're looking at this well is, during wet periods, it seems like the water levels are covered within about 5 feet of baseline conditions. And during the droughts at this location, water levels could be maybe less than 10 feet deeper, and if there were no climate change. The change in storage is usually very similar to changes in water levels. And what we're seeing here is some conclusions we drew from this is that there's no evidence of chronic decline in groundwater levels at this location. Also, the range of groundwater levels are similar to historic. So these are all kind of good signs under these scenarios. This is important because one of the SMCs is to demonstrate whether or not the basin do we think the basin will have chronic declines in groundwater levels? And so far, based on our modeling, it does not look like that. So I'll just go around, look at some more wells, give everyone a feel about how the basin might respond in the future. So we're gonna look at a well here. This is an agricultural well, kind of near the Bardsdale area. And it's a very similar story. Groundwater levels have similar ranges in the future as modeled historically. And there does not appear to be a downward trend. I'll move through these kind of quickly, and if anyone wants to go back and look at them, we can do that. But here's another well up in the city of Fillmore. Again, kind of similar story. You might have a little more of a, according to the future scenario during a mega drought with climate change. The water levels might be, say, less than 20 feet deep here during the peak of the drought. And this is where we start considering the screen interval of each well. Hundreds of wells throughout both of these basins. And that's what you see here in the gray band. The gray band is based on information we have from United's database. Where's the top and bottom of the screen interval? And so top of screen starts about 60 feet below ground surface here. and it goes all the way down to 380 feet below what the graph is showing. And some of the discussions we've been having is that as long as groundwater levels remain above the bottom of the screen, the well should still be operable, and therefore it's not really a dry well situation, which might be undesirable and significant. So this is something that we're considering when we're running these model runs at each time, is where might wells be going dry and for what period of time and things like that. But so this well is fine according to the model. I'll jump over here to the second rising groundwater zone between Piru Basin and Fillmore Basin. So groundwater levels here are pretty shallow, close to ground surface, and at times, often groundwater levels are actually above ground surface. And what we see here is a similar story. Really no trend, things are flat, water levels are recovering. You might have a little more of a drop here, and this well still, according to the model, could still function. And after I show you one more well, I'll give you a summary of how many wells went dry. This well is up in the town of Piru. It's a domestic well. Again, similar story. Similar range of groundwater levels and no chronic decline in groundwater levels. So when it comes to evaluating dry wells throughout the basin, we looked at, I think, at least 330-ish production wells where we actually have information on the screen depths. And I'd like to just say that it's on our judgment, no production wells are predicted to go dry, even under the 2070 scenario, according to the model. But I say that with a caveat because when we ran the model, or when we got the model results from United and we compared water levels with screen depths, some wells did indicate that they were dry. But when I went and looked back at each hydrograph, based on measured water levels we have in the general vicinity of some of these wells, I don't believe that these wells would actually go dry. It's just that the model is kind of underestimating the groundwater levels constantly. So I just wanted to be transparent and say that there were a few the model tends to underpredict groundwater levels in this area in the northern part of Fillmore, where we have some deep ag wells. I don't believe these would actually go dry. There are also a couple domestic wells on the edges of the model, and it's common for models to not be, the edges of models tend to be the kind of, especially without a lot of control points, you don't have, it's common that groundwater levels might not be as well calibrated as the rest of the model. And overall, the model does seem very well calibrated. So yeah, I just want to mention there's a couple domestic wells according to the model, but again, looking at water levels, there's been no historical, as far as I've heard, accounts of these wells going dry. And since the model predicted similar water levels in the future as in the past, we don't think there's a reason to be concerned. On top of that, there are some monitoring wells that would go dry at times, but we don't think that would, at least, yeah, we don't think that would be a significant effect because these do not produce water for beneficial use. And I believe there was a comment from some of the directors about, which wells have the highest risk of going dry. And I'll just show you an example. This is from a presentation or last month's board meeting, but this is an example of a shallow well where the screen's only about 86 feet deep. And you can see during that drought, the water levels, according to the model, got very close to the bottom of the screen. So I kind of went through and looked at all the hydrographs, and the trend is that any well, generally like less than 100 feet deep, is kind of close or, I guess flirting with the dry well situation. But again, as long as things in the future, the model is indicating things should be similar to the past. And since there haven't been accounts of dry wells in the past, we don't think there's going to be an issue. And with that, I'm done with my presentation. If there's any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer them.
Really
Do you
interesting.
have any questions? Go ahead, Ed.
Just my comment was very, very interesting information and data. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick, so if I understand what you said about the 100-foot, so is that our average depth of wells is roughly 100 feet? Because I don't think that's the case.
No, it's not. There's a subset of wells. I went back and looked at all those stress test results, you know, the model scenarios in which wells would have gone dry under like doubling pumping. And no, it's a certain, like, I think up to 30 or 40 wells are about that shallow. Actually, even maybe up to 200 feet, but that was under a very, you know, extreme scenario of doubling pumping. But so bring stress test scenarios that we presented a month ago and related to what we're looking at here. My first slide, I didn't mention this, but we project under the climate change scenario about a 10% increase in pumping. And one of the scenarios that we ran was a 20% increase. So when I looked at those wells, there was only one well, if we did a 20% increase, that would have gone dry. It was an ag well. I believe it was in this area, but again, it was a very shallow well. It was like 100 feet deep. So we're looking at like a handful of wells, maybe half dozen or dozen that are about 100 feet deep and are most susceptible to the deeper declines in groundwater levels during droughts.
Okay, I saw Gordon shake his head. Do you have anything else to include on that?
Yeah, just 100 feet is very shallow for most production wells.
And that includes domestic.
Yeah.
So it's not really the ag wells. I should have, to rephrase that, it's probably more so the domestic wells.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think that's important when we're making these decisions that most wells are more than 100 feet. And you're stating that, for the screen tops at 86.
There's probably very small domestic wells. I'm not even aware of any wells that are that shallow, but I don't have access to everyone's wells.
Well, and it's each user decides on how deep their well is, correct?
Yes.
Okay, because that's an issue as well. I just need to make sure that people understand that. Lisa, were there any comments or questions?
We've got two comments in the chat. Debbie says she absolutely agrees with Ed and Gordon that efficiency will continue to increase. And then Dan Detmer is pointing out that trend lines are not appropriate. These are not forecasts of future basin conditions.
Okay, so putting a median on there isn't as helpful for forecasting. Okay, thank you. Any other questions from directors or any other public comments? Patrick, thank you for bringing this up. I think it's important that we understand these issues. And I like these red lines a lot better than the others. I can't say that enough.
Complicated situation, yeah.
All right, I couldn't unmute. I just want to say thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. As seeing my first presentation for this agency, it was very helpful information and you presented it very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up.
All right. So I'll hand it back to Tony. Tony's going to talk about the surface water SMC.
Okay, so to backtrack a little bit to last month's presentations, we talked about the relationships between water levels and key wells in the basins, as well as stream flow in two of the primary areas with groundwater dependent ecosystems. And so we're going to refresh that conversation a little bit by looking at the 2070 data from the model. We'll take a look and see what impact climate change has on the depth to water during drought periods in those GDE areas, and then see what kind of impact we have on surface waters associated with that. So let's refresh our memories again. We had this nice graphic that was prepared by United, and it's showing what happens during a drought period here, starting out in 2011 This is cubic feet per second of stream flow. This is a Fillmore up here, just to orient you. Santa Paula is down here. And so we're talking about a fair amount of water being in the stream in 2011, where we had pretty healthy conditions going on. But roughly a year later, we can see the length of the wetted reaches beginning to retract. And right in this little area right here is the fish hatchery that we'll talk about. And we can just see over time, United did a nice summary graphics here that give us an idea of how over time, as the drought continues and continues multi-year, we end up with a situation where the wetted intervals begin to contract. They get smaller and smaller with time. And so to help us predict on what kind of surface water flows we might expect, United looked at a variety of wells in the two basins and found two, one for the Willard Road area and one for the fish hatchery area, where there's a nice empirical relationship between the groundwater elevation in a particular well and the discharge, their surface water flows that they measured at these two locations. And so you can see nicely fitted curves to those. These curves are not predictive, they're purely empirical. So it's not saying that the decline in water level at this particular well is causing the change in discharge at their sampling point in the river. So the relationship is purely empirical, but definitely useful for how we're going to assess this. So to refresh your memory, we looked at selecting those wells, or actually United staff looked at selecting those wells that had a good calibration between the observed and measured historical period. So that's how they got to pick this particular well. There's a nice correlation there, nice calibration. And the same thing for the fish hatchery. They picked a well that was nicely calibrated, so we can have some confidence that the model was actually giving us reasonable results as we move forward. And so here are these wells. Here's the Willard Road area for the GDEs, and Willard Road's like right down in here. We'll get a zoomed in version in a moment. Here's the fish hatchery area. There's the well that was used for Willard Road. The well that was used for the fish hatchery is just off the edge of the map here. So we've talked about these two areas as being prime areas where we're talking about groundwater dependent ecosystems in these two basins with a variety of species, willows, cottonwoods, etc. That occur there. So let's drill down a little bit more, no pun intended, into the fish hatchery area. To reorient you, we've got a new director, so we want to make sure she understands the geography that we're talking about here. So this is the area, the general area, and the yellow dashed line there where the groundwater dependent ecosystems are. This red dashed line represents the approximate boundary between the Fillmore groundwater basin and the Santa Paula basin. So this kind of straddles that area. And so we use the groundwater 27 model run to give us an idea of what would be the predicted groundwater levels, the simulated groundwater levels at the area where they do their surface water measurements. What would we expect the groundwater to look like there? And so we have a curve that looks something like this. And so you can see we're starting back here in 1985, running out into the future. So you can see there's the late 1980s drought. Here's the drought we just went through, and we're coming back out of it. And then this is the future simulation information that's been appended to that. You'll see on this particular plot, there's some red dots there. There's some red dots here that, in my mind, are a little bit suspicious in the model. We'll drill into that a little bit more and figure that out. But we have situations where we have a trend in the water levels, and then it jumps 30 or 40 feet for 1 month, and then immediately returns to the same trend after that. So these points are a little bit suspicious in our mind, so we're not going to discuss them further, but I did want to flag them so that you know what we're talking about. Oh, I should note the green line there represents ground surface, so just so you understand what we're talking about there. So this is the simulated water level near where they do the surface water sampling. So last month we talked about how well does the groundwater model calibrate at a particular point in this GDE area. And we used this particular well right here as our example. So there's the well. This is the hydrograph over the historical period. And we looked at the measured values. That's the blue dots here. versus the predicted values. That's the yellow and black dots here. And in general, the model's under predicting the water levels in this area. So if we're going to use this to help us, we need to understand what that correction factor might look like. So if we're looking at these two here, we're looking at about a difference of 40 feet in this last drought period, excuse me, the late 1980s drought period, and something on the order of 38 feet in the most recent drought period. So we know that there's some less than optimal calibration there. That's not a dig at the model at all. It's overall, it's calibrated extremely well. But in this particular area, it's under predicting water levels. So we've got sort of our fudge factors. If we use this and apply it to the actual model data, so we see something like this, and this allows us to be able to estimate what the depth of water would be during the drought, during these two periods. So it gives us an idea of what's going on there. So
Tony,
this is a historical period. Yes?
When you say 27 feet, is there anything from the ground surface that we have to take in consideration of?
Such as?
30 feet below groundwater or ground surface, is there anything? I know the GDEs are dependent, but we don't have to look at them unless it's 30 feet, the root system, or am I going into a different area?
No, you're okay. You're ahead of me.
Okay,
a little
sorry.
bit in the presentation. No problem. So what we just want to do here is establish about how deep is the water going to be during the drought. What's our best educated guesstimate of what that's going to be, and then we'll decide what would that impact be on GDEs in that area.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get the magnitude, and then we'll decide. This goes to the question: is it a significant and unreasonable effect? And we'll talk about that in a moment. So now we're going to move into looking at the actual model output. So there's that same graph you saw earlier. And if we apply the same kinds of fudge factor routines, if you will, we can determine what the depth of water is during the late 1980s, what the model says it would be in the most recent drought. So we're looking at 30, maybe 34 feet under the most recent drought. And then because we've appended on future data into the model, we could, if we want, go ahead and look at future droughts and see what the depth of water might estimate to be. So we see things like there's this particular drought, which is right after the start. And remember, we were talking about having a fairly dry period there. So we may end up with water levels that maybe around 51 feet below surface. But you can see they don't stay at 51 feet very long. They begin to come back relatively quickly. 31 feet, even out here, this drought, we're at 21 feet below ground surface. So we're beginning to get a feel for where the water level might be during a drought. Okay, so we're going to take that now. We've answered that question about where do we think groundwater is going to be during a drought. And we're going to now look at what does that do to surface water flow. Okay, what's the rising groundwater impact associated with the 2070 climate change? So if we look at the two curves, similar to what Patrick showed you before, there's the baseline in black, the sort of, I guess that's orangish color looking there is the 2070 curve. And so we're looking at what the water levels are in that key well. That's our crossover. Remember the one with the empirical relationship between surface water flow and groundwater elevation. And so the interesting thing we see right here is, yes, there is a difference, but it's not a massive difference at this particular well. You know, there's 10 feet there. What is that? Maybe 15 feet, something like that. So it's not a massive change in difference. But when the basin is fuller, there's very little difference between the 2070 and the baseline values. So taking that orange curve, the 2070 values, plugging it into our empirical formula, we end up with a graph that looks like this. So this is simulated rising groundwater in cubic feet per second. So we topped it out at 50 here. And so you can see there are large periods of time in this particular location where there is still surface water flow. The amount varies obviously from year to year, but there still is surface water flow here. There are also periods where there is not surface water flow. And you can see it sometimes it's a significant number of months in a row. I lumped this all together. There's like a 1.5 or 2 month period in here where we got positive flow right there, but I just ignored that for the purposes of this presentation. That's a pretty long period of time where there isn't surface water flow in this particular location. Okay, so now we're going to go back to a complicated graph again. So here we have the surface water, the rising groundwater in gray. So you see here those periods we were talking about where we didn't have it. So rising groundwater plotted on the axis, vertical axis on the right. The blue is the simulated water level at that particular location. So you can see when the water levels are going down, okay, the amount of rising groundwater is going down. Totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. And from that, we can define those periods where we don't have any rising groundwater and the length of time associated with those. So there's 46 months, 44, 66, etc. there. So this is giving us a way to say, if the future climate situation is as we've simulated here, what might the range of times be where we would not have surface water flow? We would have no rising groundwater at that particular location. And so this gives us a good idea of that. So let's look at this a little bit more. Is that kind of information consistent with what United saw in their field observations? So how quickly does the fish hatchery reach of the Santa Clara River go dry? So we're talking about this little piece of the world right up here in the corner. So if we look after roughly a year, we begin to see this line has shortened. Compare this to this. The line is shortening. When we get to 2 years, we're pretty much dry in this area of the GDEs. And therefore, so what we're saying is the wetted reach begins to shrink. It gets smaller within a year. It starts that process. And within a couple of years, that area around the fish hatchery where the GDEs are is likely dry. There's no rising groundwater there. So the ideas are pretty consistent with each other. The length of time obviously depends on the climates that we scenario, and that's not really something that's addressed by these observational data. So what did we learn from all this? So extended periods of below normal precipitation are possible in the 2070 future conditions modeling, okay? Water levels under the 2070 climate change conditions are estimated to be somewhere in the 21 to 51 feet below ground surface during the droughts, with most in the 30 to 35 feet below ground surface kind of range. Rising groundwater may cease during moderate to severe drought conditions and remain that way for many months or even a few years. Okay. And the wetted reach of the Santa Clara River near the fish hatchery begins to shrink within 1 year of a drought initiation and will probably be dry within 2 years if the drought lasts that long. Now, we're saying that using the information from our most recent drought and extrapolating that would be the same for all droughts. Obviously, all droughts are not the same. The severity changes from year to year. The length of time changes and that kind of thing. So we've learned several things here about the fish hatchery area. So I think a couple of takeaways is that groundwater elevations may be about groundwater levels rather might be, let's say 30 to 35 feet below ground surface during the droughts. That's an important thing to take into consideration. Okay, and that kind of situation where we don't have rising groundwater may continue for several years during a major drought. So is the Willard Road similar to this? So let's look at this one. So here's the area of the GDEs, once again outlined in the yellow dots. This is Santa Paula over here on the far left-hand side. The red dashed line is the approximate boundary between Santa Paula and Fillmore Basin, and Willard Road's this little guy right here. So we just labeled this the Willard Road area. So we asked the groundwater model to tell us, going into the future, what do the groundwater levels look like near the sampling site at Willard Road? So here's what the water levels look like. Green line being land surface, ground surface. The blue line is the simulated water level. And so we see periods where it drops below the surface and maybe 5 feet, maybe as much as 15 feet, kind of a flashy looking response, sort of meaning it's lots of ups and downs associated with it. Okay, but a lot of the time it's water levels that are above ground surface. So if we take our Willard Road crossover well, where we had the empirical relationship, apply the orange curve into the empirical formula, and overlay that with our water levels, we end up with this situation. So the gray is the rising groundwater, which goes with the axis here on the right-hand side. And so what we're saying here is that this particular location, we're not expecting to see that the rising groundwater would drop below zero, that there's always a little bit, maybe it's 5 CFS, but there's always something there over the model timeframe through 2070. So does that make sense with the observational data? So let's look at the Willard Road area, and just to orient you, look at that little dark spot right there that we're talking about. That's the area we're in question. And so we can see after a year, and we're starting out here on the 3rd year, we're beginning to get some impact, some intermittentness to the rising groundwater here, the wetted reach. After 3 years and continuing on after 5 years, we're going to see something that looks like that reach has pretty much dried out. So the wetted reach begins to contract in 2 to 3 years, probably dry in 5 to 6 years, according to this observational data. So what kind of things are we looking at?
Tony, let us know when you want to stop for questions.
Okay, let me go through this one slide and then we'll stop for some questions and then go into some summary and kind of change gears a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay, so there are extended periods of below normal precipitation possible, same as with the previous scenario. Climate change conditions are estimated to be 15 feet or less for drought condition water levels rather. And rising groundwater is expected to decrease to as low as 5 to 10 CFS during major droughts, but didn't cease in the Willard Road area. So these field observations are pretty consistent with what the wetted reaches look like from United's field observations. So that's kind of the summary of what we've learned. Very similar conclusions. The actual amounts differ. You know, the amount of water level decline or the groundwater elevation below, excuse me, not elevation, but depth below a particular point on the ground during a drought varies. In this instance, 15 feet or less. In the other one, maybe 30 to 35 feet. So do we want to do some questions now, I think, before I move on to the summary?
Yes, directors, questions? Any directors have any questions? I have one. Okay, so your example in the fish hatchery, they have pools. Is this our job to make sure that those pools are full? Or I just want to understand our rules and regulations, how we're supposed to do. Because is it that they can pump water into those pools, or that we have to make sure that there's groundwater that they can have? How does that work?
If we step back, then the agency is charged with the responsibility of considering the impact of their management actions on the beneficial uses and users of that groundwater.
Okay,
So
and I
if they have,
appreciate that.
So does it mean that you have to say that there's zero impact to their facility? No, that's not what it means. It means you must consider the impact to the beneficial users. Like, for example, if we're talking about just regular groundwater wells out there, and we've got an irrigation well, for example, you're going to consider what would be the impact of your management plan on the water levels in that well. Does it mean that you can't say that the water levels might go down 10 feet or up 10 feet for that matter? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that you can't change. It just means you must consider the impact.
Okay, and so that's similar to the GDEs in regards, and what I was trying to set you up for was there are GDEs that have root systems, you know, like the golden oak, that the root system that goes 30 feet, we have to, there are certain things based on DWR that we need to be aware of and take into consideration. Correct?
Correct. There are things like that we're going to take into consideration. And I think when we see Mr. Keebler's presentation later on today, we'll have a little more information on that. And I saw Christian Broderick's face pop up on the Hollywood Squares here on my screen a moment ago. Is there something you'd like to add, Christian?
I was just going to add that for most of the riparian trees that are occurring along, the vegetation has rooting depths that's much shallower than 30 feet. It's more like 10 to 15 feet maximum. The oaks are the exception at 30 feet. Just to clarify.
I appreciate that. There's a lot that goes into this. There's a lot of people's desires to have certain things thrive no matter what. And I want to make sure that the rules of Sigma and what this GSP has to do for both of them is clear for all stakeholders. And so I'm bringing up difficult situations to make sure we have those conversations. So that's where I'm coming from. I like to put it all out there to make sure we're discussing and evaluating. So appreciate that.
Fair enough. A comment that I would make, and I think I see Dan's making the same, is that the fish hatchery may have been placed there to take advantage of springs, but it's the water. I think they're one of our largest pumpers, and use wells to pump the water into the hatchery portion.
They are, and so I want to make sure that people understand that it's not that they're creating it from surface water, but they're actually pumping. That's a huge demand that they utilize, and I want to make sure everyone is aware of that. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to hearing what Stillwater has to say about the Sespe Cienega development of the 270 acres there too. So I think that'll come later.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we go to Lisa with what's in our chat?
I would, if I may, I would comment that the example near the hatchery, that's a deeper completion. It doesn't behave like other nearby wells. We think there's a casing or a well construction issue. The water levels in that well that we measure are more reflective of shallow water levels than what we'd expect in the aquifer it's perfed in. So we do have some other wells. I don't think that was a great example well to use for that demonstration, even though it is probably the closest well and belonging to the hatchery, but not all our calibrations in that area are so poor as what was shown in the example. I wanted people to know. Thank you.
Okay.
No, that wasn't the implication at all.
No. Right. Lisa?
So that covers some of the comments in the chat. The only one I think that hasn't been directly answered is, has surface water in the fish hatchery area ceased during historical droughts? And if so, for how long?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head.
But we'll look into it.
Murray, are you with us?
Yeah, in the 1950s, I do believe it did go dry, that reach, because as I recall, seeing some notes of zero flow. But down in the other section near Willard Road, I've never heard of that one ever going dry.
Okay.
Thanks, Murray. That's Murray McEachern, one of our hydrologists.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I believe that the fish hatchery was put in that location far before any of us were even evolved to make sure that it had always a water source. So I do agree that it's probably because of the deep wells and so forth. There's another question, Lisa.
Yeah, so kind of a follow on. Would it have gone dry in the recent drought without the United Water Conservation District releases?
Would the Sespe Cienega? I mean, it did go dry in the recent drought.
Brian, I don't know if you want to just unmute in case you need a clarification.
I was asking about the fish hatchery area.
Yeah, so that did go dry in, I think we were looking at those kind of wetted reach areas, and it was 2014 when there was no rising groundwater in that section.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions from any directors or public comments?
I just want to thank Murray for that information. I think it's important historical context that that at least the fish hatchery reach has gone dry under historical conditions, that this is not a new phenomenon that we'd be looking at.
Agreed. Thank you, Brian. And I think it's important as we look at this whole seeing into the future and how we have survived the past. I think that's important. Okay, Tony. Ed, one more?
A question for Murray. Murray, do you have any idea how much the fish hatchery releases just when it's in normal production?
No, I don't. Jason probably has the numbers of what they pump.
I know when I've been there, a lot of water is coming out the west end, and lots of cormorants and other things are usually sitting there being very hopeful.
Yeah, and usually that percolates in the first, afterwards it goes into the Fillmore Basin, percolates within the first probably half mile or so.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate this for just historical value as we move forward. Okay, Tony, it sounds like there's no more questions, so go for it.
All right. So this quick summary slide here, I'm not going to read it all to you. It repeats the information that was on the other slides regarding rising groundwater, the surface water flows, et cetera, and the depth of groundwater during droughts. But really the focus here is the comments column. And so these are the questions for the board to wrestle with. Are those periods of no rising groundwater a significant and unreasonable impact to surface water beneficial uses and users? And are these modeled water levels of 30 to 35 feet, for example, below ground surface during a drought, a significant and unreasonable impact? So those are a couple of questions that the board's going to have to wrestle with and make a determination as to whether we're following in that significant and unreasonable category, and therefore want to propose some sort of project management action or mitigation for that. So let's pretend if we're going to say one of these is in place and it's going to be significant and unreasonable, so what kind of mitigation measures should or could you consider? Okay, we've talked about in the past reducing groundwater extractions near the river. That's not a favored option by anybody. We've talked a little bit about Article 21 water and buying some more of that whenever it becomes available. And we know that those have positive benefits when that happens to the basin, and in some cases, significant positive benefits to the basin. There was also something mentioned by some of the directors at past meetings of surface water augmentation with groundwater. So we take a little pumped groundwater and we add it to the river to try to provide a mitigation or a project that would help mitigate those impacts. So I thought we should walk through on a conceptual basis an idea for that. So here's my cartoon drawing, fish hatchery area. The sort of blue-gray area right here is meant to represent a wetted interval. Okay, so the drought occurs, it's starting, there it goes. The wetted reach is getting smaller. It continues and it reaches a point where, let's say 50% of the, only 50% of the wetted reach remains. Okay, and I picked 50% just because it's a convenient number. You can pick whatever you think is appropriate, but I picked 50%. And so maybe we have a trigger that says when 50% has disappeared or 50% remains, either way you wish to think about it, then the surface water augmentation program would begin with the goal of trying to maintain approximately 50% of the wetted reach. And so I've plunked some yellow dots on here that represent wells. They are not actual locations of any wells that I'm aware of. I just arbitrarily dropped them on here for our discussion purposes. So what might happen at this point in time is we began pumping a well and augmenting the flow to the river to try to maintain our 50%, our trigger level, if you will, at which the augmentation program would happen. But if the drought continues, okay, as we saw in some of the slides, there was an indication that the droughts might not be just a few months, but they might be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in some instances. And so we may have to have an adaptive management component to this, where we may have to use other wells and have them add water to the stream channel to try to maintain that wetted reach. Do we know how many wells we're going to take? No, we don't know that yet. It's going to depend on how much water we want to put into the stream and how much we want to reestablish. How fast does this water percolate into the ground, and a variety of things like that. So this is the concept behind a surface water augmentation program. And so I've expanded this based on some comments that directors have made, is that maybe we could do a program like this, and that this would help us deal with the potential impacts to GDEs. So what might this look like? And so I'm going to say right here very clearly, this discussion is an expansion of some of the director's comments at past meetings. It's not approved by the board. It's Tony Morgan pontificating and coming up with ideas and concepts that are meant to be offered as food for thought for the directors and the stakeholders. So what's our goal? So we're going to supply some groundwater to support the ecosystem survival through the drought. Say the water would provide some water to the root zone for the groundwater dependent vegetation and create surface water pools for amphibians, etc., that might be in those critical species that we're talking about sometimes. The augmentation system would be implemented only during drought conditions when the length of the wetted reach declines below the trigger. And in my cartoon example, the trigger was set at 50% of the wetted reach. Okay. So what's the minimum amount of wetted reach to maintain? That's going to be your trigger value, and we're going to have to rely on the biologist to help us decide what that means. Okay, but that trigger value, if exceeded, would then initiate the groundwater wells to augment surface water flows. Okay, we would think that the groundwater used for augmentation would come from deeper aquifers, wells perforated in deeper aquifers. We don't want to be taking water out of the shallow aquifers that are feeding the rising groundwater in the area. You're sort of arguing against yourself and battling yourself if you're doing that. So you'd want wells perforated in the deeper aquifers. And the idea is that if possible, we're not going to drill any new wells, meaning we don't need these wells in an augmentation program every year. We need them only when a severe drought condition presents itself. So we would take excess capacity from existing wells, and I call it crowdsourcing, from multiple wells, and putting them all together to develop a network of wells that could supply water. So for example, if I went to Director Kimball and he had one of the wells we were considering, and I asked him, how often do you use this particular irrigation well? And if he says, I use it on Tuesdays and Fridays, but that's all, well, then we would ask for the other days of the week. Could we, during a drought condition, be engage you to use that well to provide water to the stream to maintain this wetted reach? So that's the idea. And so you have a series of wells that fall into those conditions that we would like. When I thought about this, there's some other ideas and and costs that are going to be associated with it. There's going to be a little bit of well retrofitting. We're going to have some changes to the discharge pipe, meaning most of the time it goes to the field, but we're going to need to tee that off and send some of it to the river. So there's going to be modifications to the discharge piping. There's going to be metering because you don't necessarily want the agricultural operator there, for example, to pay for the pump charges associated with that. That's an agency issue. There's power costs, and there's some sort of contribution towards the maintenance costs of the wells. You want those wells to be operable and ready to go when you call upon them during a drought. So the number of wells depends on the length of the wetted interval that we're trying to reestablish. What's the stream bed percolation rate, quantity of water needed to be reestablished. So in concept, it's fairly simple to implement, but I wanted the directors to be aware of the quantities of water that we might be talking about. So 1 cubic feet per second, and if you saw, that's much below what we see in a lot of those little colored dots on United's map for the various reaches. So 1 CFS is about 450 gallons a minute. So that could probably be supplied by one well, one typical agricultural well, for example. If we said, no, we need more water in the river, let's say we need 5 CFS, well, that's about 2,250 gallons per minute, which might be 2 to 4 wells, depending on the capacities of those wells. If we said no, 10 CFS is it, that's 4,500 gallons a minute. That's 4 to 7 wells that would have to be a part of that program, estimated. So if we were to continue this program over a multi-year period, the amount of groundwater that could be pumped might get to be extensive. So as an example, 450 gallons per minute over a year is 726 acre feet per year. So we could end up putting a lot of water into the stream to maintain those wetted intervals. And we have to be cognizant of that. What would be the cost associated with that? I need to put a little more calculator to it, but I'm guessing you're going to be paying 12 to 15 bucks an acre foot for power costs for that amount of water. And if you amortize out the cost of a new well over 30 years and figure that out, that's maybe another 10 bucks. So maybe $22, $25 an acre foot would be actual operational kinds of cost. And you'd want to put something in there for a contribution to build up a little bit of money to be able to assist with the maintenance, because you're going to be applying wear and tear to that piece of equipment. So you can do that math. If you do 25 times 726, that tells you a dollar amount per year that might be associated with that kind of activity. So this was just intended to flesh out that idea of providing pumped groundwater into the system a little more thoroughly and make the board aware that there are costs and coordination that needs to be done by probably more than one entity out there to provide enough water to be able to maintain a wetted reach at the 50% level, for example. So I'm going to stop there and field some questions from the board.
All right, directors, any questions?
Comments? Ken, Tony, the board will have to decide what an undesirable result is.
I think that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah. Any other directors, questions, comments? Any questions from the chat, Lisa?
I'm not seeing any.
All right. This is a lot to consider, and I really appreciate the dialogue that we're having. The question, just to make sure that this presentation is uploaded on our website, to make sure that there's any stakeholders that aren't here today that can see that, I'd really appreciate.
Fair enough.
So this is receive and file. If there's no further questions, and do you have any other question?
Just another comment. It would be interesting to know what, as I said before, what the hatchery is pumping out, what kind of flow they're pumping out all the time when they're in regular production.
We can look that up, Director McFadden. At some years, they're the largest pumper in the district. You know,
right.
So when they're in full capacity, it's significant volume.
And everything they pump goes, when they're in production, goes through a concrete line channel and goes straight back out to the river.
Correct, but the Cienega project is working to recontour to try and keep those tailwaters from the fish rearing on site and support the wetland habitats there. So there's a major restoration project underway, and it's going to involve earthwork and with the goal, I believe, of preventing discharge back to the river.
Well, that's interesting because we're supposed to look at the water in and out and the GDEs and so forth. So are we supposed to plan for that? Or I thought it was from 2015. And so if that water doesn't go back out, then we're cutting off systems down the river, right?
Well, some of that'll be lost to ET, but some of that'll percolate on site. It's not like, you know, all the water will just be gone. It's just the recharge area will be more constrained, I would think.
Okay, and I'm not picking on the fish hatchery. It's an example. What I do want to make sure is that our board is looking at every point that, you know, surface water is close. I know that is, if Candace was here, she would be advocating to make sure that we understand the water at those points. And we do know that there are certain points on there. So I just feel that's important to raise that question and to make sure so that we don't just assume that water levels are high over at the fish hatchery. We know they pump up. There's things in different ways. So that's why I'm asking that we make sure we look at it.
Dan, looking at the plans for the SSB Cienega site, it looks like I see the channelization and the looks like a well-organized settling pond sort of setup. So it's
yeah, Chris might be able to comment on that. I think he's he may well know our next guest here may have comments for us in that regard.
I'm probably jumping ahead, so I'll be quiet.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, looks like Brian Bondi has a question.
Go ahead, Brian.
No, thank you. So on the maps, Tony, where you're showing this pumping concept, it would be helpful if we could see where the basin boundary is. My question has to do with if we're going to draw water, I think for this to work, in some cases, we'd have to draw water out of the Piru Basin to augment stream flow, which would then percolate into the Fillmore Basin. So I guess we just would have to think through how one basin that is contributing more to another basin is made whole.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question as to how that would be handled and to whether the agency wants to go into an agreement to manage the basins together or separately.
And Brian, I suppose that also would relate to how water comes out the other end of Fillmore Basin and is used west of us.
Well, it didn't look like you would need to do this in that area unless you determine that.
Correct.
Right.
But if you do determine you need to do it there, then yes, you'd be increasing outflow to the basin during a drought.
That's not for GDE considerations. That's just what we're doing or what we're doing anyway for irrigation in the Santa Paula Basin.
Well, and I only bring it not only for GDEs. I mean, I focused on that point, but we're also focused on agriculture and our municipal uses as well. I want to make sure that all of you, even stakeholders that are watching today, that that's a really key issue. But I do want to make sure that we have buy-in from all. And so that's why I'm asking these kind of uncomfortable questions, because we all need to be in buy-in. Thank you. Gordon, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, looking at that Cienega project makes me wonder if, or ask the question, is the most, if we need to do some remediation or support in a drought, is running it down the river the most efficient use of the water? Or would it be participating in the Cienega project or a similar project? We need to know what plants and what animals are at risk, and how best, whether we need to mimic nature or whether we can actually support them in other ways, or other designs, rather than just running it down the river, for more efficient use of the water. And for that, we need to hear more from the environmental community, or or perhaps Stillwater or Christopher knowledgeable about what specific species it is that we may be affecting.
Well, then we're also affecting the basin below, right? We're affected by the basin above, and we're affecting the basin below. Right. And below that, we're the start, and we keep trickling down. We have to make sure that we, all stakeholders understand that as well. All right, any other questions? If not, this is a receive and file, I believe. And so the motion, I need a motion to receive and file this report.
So moved.
It's moved by Director McFadden. I saw the M, I apologize. It's been a long day. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
All right, Director Pace will be the second. I need further discussion. Roll call, Eva, please.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
yes.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Pace,
Yes.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
All right, that motion is approved unanimously. Thank you so much for Tony and Patrick, your in-depth discussion on this. It really is helpful. Are we okay to move back to the monitoring wells project, Dan?
I could do that if you wish, or would you like to carry on the same theme with the GDEs and I just want to be mindful we have a guest here. But,
yes, well then yeah. I always appreciate the guests. Thank you very much. Why don't we do that, and we'll move to the information item, and then we'll go back to that. Thank you, Dan, for your kindness. We'll do the Santa Clara River riparian vegetation response drought. So Chris, welcome to our board meeting.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And thank you to the directors for having me today. My name is Chris Kibler. I'm a PhD candidate at UCSB, and my dissertation research is looking at GDEs in the Santa Clara River. So I'm hoping it might be relevant for your audience. And specifically looking at the sensitivity of GDEs to water table declines during the most recent drought. And I'm sure you've heard about this from other stakeholders. These GDEs, these riparian tree species, are really important vegetation communities from an ecological point of view. There's really sensitive animal species that need them for habitat, such as the Bell's vireo. They also promote plant biodiversity within the floodplain. They actually regulate the hydrology of the floodplain as well, so they control how water and sediment move through the river. And these riparian tree species are groundwater dependent. They have root systems that extend about 3 meters below the surface. And they draw water from shallow groundwater, and that's how they survive. And so, the cottonwoods and the willows are really the species that I'm thinking about here. They need that shallow groundwater in order to survive. And if they lose access to that shallow groundwater, then they experience stress and pretty quickly experience mortality because they don't do a good job once they lose access to that groundwater. And that's something we saw in the most recent drought, especially within the Fillmore Basin. So this is a picture from the Fillmore Basin. This was taken in March 2017, I think just upstream of the fish hatchery. And this used to be a really nice, healthy stand of cottonwoods and maybe some willows as well. And what happened during the drought is the water table declined, these trees lost access to shallow groundwater. And then by the worst part of the drought in 2017, we saw conditions like this, where there used to be a really healthy bunch of trees in the floodplain, and it basically got reduced to a pile of dead sticks. And so this is the type of stuff that motivates my work. And my ideas and my opinions today really begin and end with GDEs. So I don't want to encroach on the territory of other stakeholders, but we're trying to understand how does this sort of change happen in a GDE, and then what is the sensitivity to the groundwater elevation within the floodplain. So the research questions that I'm going to be talking about today. First, just what are the general trends of tree health that we saw during the most recent drought, especially in the Fillmore Basin? And the second question is really the core question of my presentation. How strong is that relationship between changes in groundwater elevation and changes in land cover within these GDEs? And then finally, thinking about management a little bit, are there critical thresholds where these water table declines are going to cause stress and mortality in the GDEs? And so I think some of the points that I'll make here today will build nicely off of Tony's presentation and hopefully give you some food for thought about some of these management issues. So what I did for this analysis is I combined two distinct data sets. The first was groundwater wells, which we've been talking about all night. And the second was satellite imagery. And I used satellite imagery to see how the health of these GDEs changed during the most recent drought. And so I identified 6 different GDEs within the Fillmore and the Santa Paula basins, a little farther downstream. And for each of those 6 sites, I identified a groundwater well that indicated the water table elevation. And then I looked at the satellite images to see how the land cover was changing in those riparian woodlands. And so some of these sites should be familiar to you. I've got slightly different names than people who came before me. The Fillmore Cienega is what I'm calling the fish hatchery site. Sespe Confluence, that's where Sespe Creek meets the main stem of the river. I think Tony called it Willard Road. I'm calling it East Grove. But in general, these are the main GDEs that exist within the Fillmore Basin. And then I'm also looking at 3 more sites in the Santa Paula Basin, down by the Freeman Diversion. Those aren't in the Fillmore Basin, but I think we can expect that they would behave really similarly. And so again, what I did is I took groundwater data for each of these sites, and then I used satellite imagery to see how the land cover changed during the most recent drought. And I was trying to figure out, is the groundwater changing actually affecting the GDEs during drought conditions? So for each study site, I identified a well that indicated the shallow groundwater trends. And I'm really focused on like the most shallow of the groundwater. I think there's domestic use and there's agricultural use, and they can punch a well down pretty deep and get some nice deeper groundwater. But these tree species don't really have that liberty. Their root systems are typically going down to about 3 meters at the deepest, and so they really care about the most shallow groundwater that's in that uppermost aquifer. And so what I did is I identified a well at each of these study sites that indicated the water table trends. And then I looked at the change in groundwater elevation during the most recent drought. And I used June 2011 as a baseline. And that's a pretty nice baseline because there was a pretty wet winter right before that. And then obviously 2012 to 2019, we saw really unprecedented drought conditions. And so what I did is I developed these normalized hydrographs looking at how the groundwater elevation changed after June 2011. And Tony and Dan and some other people were having this conversation a few minutes ago. How do we represent the shallow aquifer in places where there's only deeper well data available? One of the challenges of my work is I need shallow groundwater measurements all the way through the drought, and that doesn't exist in certain parts of the floodplain. In some cases, the well's dried up, and so there's not really any readings. In other cases, they're measured, but it's very intermittently and not on a regular basis. So whenever possible, I used a shallow well with complete time series, but there were a couple cases where I had to benchmark shallow wells against deeper wells. This is actually one of the wells right at the fish hatchery, like Tony was just talking about. And so in this case, we see that the well in red here is screened at 37 feet, and so we know that indicates the shallow trends pretty nicely. And I found that one of the wells at the fish hatchery did a really nice job at mirroring some of those shallow groundwater trends. And so in this case, there wasn't really good shallow groundwater data for this part of the basin, but by benchmarking the deeper well against a shallower well, I'm pretty confident that the data that we have is indicating the shallow groundwater trends. And so I've listed the well numbers here for the wells that I used in the Fillmore Basin. And I'll note again that I also had some study sites down in the Santa Paula Basin, but I'm focusing mostly on the Fillmore Basin for this audience. So this is the groundwater data. So I've got groundwater trends at each of the study sites, each of these different GDEs. And then I used remote sensing to look at how the land cover changed during the most recent drought. I'll also note before I move on, all of my units are in meters for these slides. I know feet tends to be the dominating unit here. In scientific journals, they rely on meters, and so everything here is going to be in meters today. So if you're not familiar with it, remote sensing is simply the analysis of satellite and aerial imagery. So for this analysis, I used a satellite network called Landsat to see how tree health changed during the most recent drought. I acquired images in June throughout the drought from 2011 to 2016. And it works pretty well for this analysis because there's 30-meter pixels. So every pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters, which does a pretty good job at resolving some of these GDEs that we're trying to study. And same thing as I did for the groundwater elevation data, I calculated the change in land cover compared to a 2011 baseline. And I focused on 3 different types of land cover that I'll talk about in a second. And then ultimately what I did is I analyzed the relationship between the change in groundwater elevation and the change in land cover over time, to see how, changes in groundwater might have affected the health of these GDEs during the most recent drought. And so just to give you a sense of what the satellite imagery looked like on the back end when I'm looking at my models, the satellite model produces 3 different values that I care about. The first is the green vegetation fraction. And that's basically the percent cover of healthy green trees in the pixel. So if you had a nice healthy GDE with lots of water availability, you'd expect to see a lot of green vegetation because the trees are doing pretty well. The second category is non-photosynthetic vegetation. And that's a really fancy way of saying dead and woody stuff. And so, during drought conditions or if something else kills a tree, all those leaves are going to disappear and you're basically going to be left with a pile of sticks. And so if you have a pile of sticks, that's going to give you a really high non-photosynthetic vegetation fraction. So that's our indicator of mortality. And then the final fraction here is soil. Just throughout the floodplain, there's a lot of barren alluvium in some places. And so soil is the third value here. And so for each pixel within the satellite imagery, we have these 3 different values, and those are always going to total 100%. So first I'm going to talk about the groundwater results, then I'll talk about the land cover data that we saw, and then we'll see how the 2 compare to each other over time. So this is a normalized hydrograph for the different study sites. I say it's normalized because you'll notice that all of the lines start at 0 there in 2011. And so what this is showing how the groundwater elevation changed after 2011 compared to that pre-drought baseline. I'm sure people in this call have spent many hours looking at hydrographs, and so some of these findings shouldn't be very surprising. We saw the biggest declines near Fillmore City, at Sespe Confluence and the fish hatchery. Those sites we saw declines of 13, 14 meters at the worst part of the drought, which is 30 feet or so. Closer to the downstream end of the Fillmore Basin, the declines weren't quite as bad and were closer to 3 meters at the worst part of the drought. And the dashed lines you see here, those are the remote sensing image dates. And so that's the dates when the satellite flew over. And so when I'm comparing the remote sensing data and the groundwater data, it's really important that the 2 data sets are close to each other in time, so we know that they're kind of looking at the same thing. And so the dashed lines here are when the satellite flew over. And again, I'll note here that the units are in meters, not in feet, sticking with scientific precedents, but not necessarily with groundwater precedents. So I want to show you the remote sensing data. So what it looks like when I'm looking at it on the back end. This is an image of the Fillmore Basin that's been run through my model. And this is looking at the land cover. This is 2011, so this is the pre-drought image here. And there's some familiar benchmarks here. Just to the left of the image off screen would be the city of Santa Paula. Above the image in the middle would be Fillmore City. And And then I've pointed out where the fish hatchery is there on the right. So you should be familiar with these sites if you've spent any time in this area. And what I've done is I've removed everything that's not the natural floodplain. So I've removed all the ag fields, I've removed the houses and the cities, and all of those have been just kind of replaced by this black. And then everything that's left is kind of the natural floodplain of the Santa Clara River. And again, I looked at 3 different land cover classes in these satellite images. The 3 I talked about earlier. And so green here is healthy vegetation. That's nice trees that have a lot of water. Red is dead and woody vegetation, what you might expect to see after a tree dies off. And the image here, this is the pre-drought image. So the red you see here is mostly senesced grass. And then blue here is soil, which is mostly just alluvium in the middle of the floodplain.
Excuse me, Christopher, where does Arundo fall in that scheme?
Arundo is going to be green here for the most part. Yeah,
I had that same question.
Yeah, Arundo is going to be green. We're working on distinguishing Arundo from the cottonwoods and the willows. That's a work in progress.
Well, and I have to ask, seeds blow in the wind. No one's planting willows in the river. And so how do you discern that when normally they wouldn't be in the river, right? So I'm trying to understand, like Arundo, it's their seeds fly and we're trying to remove that. Aren't we trying to remove some of the willows as well, or no?
What you're looking at here is the floodplain of the river. It's not necessarily the active channel.
Okay.
And so, a lot of this area, there is a lot of vegetation growing here because it's soil, basically. It's not the active channel. We do see seeds move through the floodplain, but and a lot of the way that we know that this is cottonwoods and willows is there's been a lot of on the ground work here by Stillwater and other people. So there's been, countless man hours spent at these different study sites documenting what the vegetation is. Stillwater was there, I think, in the mid 2000s, and then again, pretty recently, kind of mapping the vegetation throughout the floodplain. So we're pretty confident that the sites that have marked here are all both cottonwoods and willows.
Okay, and those have been there for 50 years, or are they new? Do we know any history on that?
They're what we call perennial wetlands, and so especially Fillmore and East Grove have been there for a while. Sesame Confluence I'm less familiar with, it's less documented, but generally, they've been there for a while up to this point.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand because they're asking us to forecast. I don't know what a while means.
East Grove and Fillmore were documented in the late 1800s. Okay. Sesame Confluence, I haven't gone back through the data, but at least the 2 sites on the east and west there were there in the 1800s.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, happy to.
And maybe even earlier.
Yeah, maybe even earlier. Yeah, I think Stillwater is really the experts here. They've done most of the on-the-ground surveys. So I would defer to Stillwater when it comes to the veg history and the veg cover over time.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to. So
while we're on a little break from the slide, if you don't, there is a question in the chat.
Sure, yeah. Sorry, I can't see the chat in my mode.
Sure. The question is, how does the drought loss of willows and cottonwoods compare to the loss due to flood events with frequencies comparable to droughts?
That's a really good question. And I think that's the key point that's going to determine whether or not these ecosystems come back in the future. So my last slide today is actually going to hit on that point, but the processes that cause mortality aren't the same as the processes that drive regeneration. And so, once the groundwater decreases, you might see mortality, but you need floods and you need scouring events to regenerate. And that's a whole different set of hydrologic processes to initiate the recovery process. And so there is a big question of once you have a really severe drought, what is the time lag until the next flood event? And that time lag, I think, is going to be really important in determining how perennial these wetlands are going into the future. So again, this is the pre-drought image here. This is 2011. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tick through these images one at a time. So I'm going to go 2011, I'm going to jump to 2013, then 2014, 2015, 2016. And what you'll see during the drought is the green vegetation is slowly replaced by dead and woody vegetation in a lot of different places within the floodplain. And those are the land cover trends that we're really interested in this analysis. This is 2011. And then this is 2013, 2014, 2015, and then 2016. And I'll do that once more just because I think it's interesting to look at. 2011, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. And so what we can see by 2016 is 2 of the 3 GDEs that we're looking at here have died off almost completely, including that fish hatchery site. And so the cottonwoods and the willows are pretty much completely dead. The site at the downstream end of the basin is still intact, but there was a bit of mortality around the edge. And so we're really curious, to what extent do we think this was driven by changes in groundwater, knowing what we know about plant physiology and how they really need this shallow groundwater in order to survive. And so what we did is, sure.
Go ahead.
Director, you had
my
a question.
Was, it would be interesting to see the 2017, 18, 19, 20.
Yeah, I think especially in recent years, there's a lot of mustard that's filled into the floodplain. And so I think you'd start to see a bit of mustard signal. I went through 2016 here because that's when the groundwater elevations were the lowest and we had that rain.
I agree with Ed, because if you see our plants, how quickly they go back, we've seen that with fires, and it's natural that it gets burned out and then it grows and comes back just as quickly. I would like to see, if you're going to do the study, to see those years to now and how it looks.
Yeah, I think Stillwater has done a lot of good on the ground work here. I've spent a fair amount of time at the Fillmore site by the fish hatchery, and the trees aren't the same as they were before the drought. So you see mustard, you see arundo, you see some castor bean and stuff filling in, but the cottonwoods and the willows just aren't there in the same way that they were before the drought. So again, that gets back to the question someone put in chat, which is, you need those floods and you need those scouring events to rejuvenate those ecosystems. And so until we get the next flood, I think it's a fair bet that we're not going to see some of those cottonwoods and willows starting to fill in.
Do we have historical data on it?
There is.
We've had droughts and floods, ebbs and flows, right?
Yeah. There's been some. There's been maybe 3 or 4 droughts of this magnitude in the last century.
Yeah.
And in most cases, there's been a flood within 2 or 3 years. I think we're starting to see different conditions going forward, especially with climate change. And so that's kind of one of the big question marks about these ecosystems is how long is it going to be until we see the next big flood that's going to clear out that floodplain, or is arundo going to fill in? And if arundo can do a little better under these conditions, then maybe it's arundo seeds going everywhere and not necessarily willow seeds. So
actually, just for point of clarification, I don't think arundo reproduces by seeds here, does it? Isn't it?
It reproduces by rhizome, but you can get pieces of the root system that will go downstream.
Right.
So when you have a flood event, the rhizome will break up and pieces of that rhizome will be transferred downstream to a new site downstream.
But it
spreads very efficiently. Yeah, not by seeds. You're correct in a botanical sense. Yeah.
Viable seeds in this climate.
Correct.
So now we're going to look at the relationship between the changes in groundwater and the changes in land cover over time. And so this is that chart here. What we can see, we see on the left is the change in healthy green vegetation, and on the right, we see the change in dead and woody vegetation. On the x-axis, you see the change in water table elevation throughout the drought compared to that pre-drought baseline. And then on the y-axis, you see the change in either healthy or dead vegetation over time. And so with the chart on the left here, what we can see is as the water table declines during the drought, we see a pretty linear decrease in healthy green vegetation over time. And as the same thing on the right, as the water table declines during the drought, we see an increase in dead and woody vegetation over time. And so, based on these results, there's a really compelling relationship between the changes in land cover and the changes in groundwater elevation. And I think one of the things that gives us a lot of confidence in this data is, these are the trends that we would expect to see, based on kind of the textbook physiology of these species. And so if you have studies where people have dug up the root systems and stuff like that, if you were to develop a hypothesis about how you think these species would behave, the results that we see here are very, very consistent with that textbook knowledge. And so thinking about management a little bit, one thing I did is I kind of fed all this data through some statistical algorithms to see if there's any thresholds that came out of this. And there were 2 kind of management-minded thresholds that came out of the data set. The first threshold was around 2 meters. And so at sites where the groundwater elevation remained within 2 meters of its pre-drought baseline, the GDEs did really well. They were really happy throughout the drought. They didn't really see that many issues over time. And so 2 meters, is kind of the low threshold where, it's kind of thumbs up and things look okay. The other threshold that came out of this data was 5 meters, and that's kind of the point of no return. And so once the water table drops 5 meters below its pre-drought baseline, that's when the entire ecosystem is really starting to show widespread mortality, and we're seeing a lot of death and really crippling ecological impacts. And then the zone between 2 and 5 is kind of transitional. Maybe it will be okay, and maybe it won't. So again, this is an empirical data set. This isn't predictive, but it gives us some sense of how these species behave. And again, it's consistent with our textbook knowledge of some of these species as well.
And so clarification, so your 5 meters is roughly 6.5 feet.
5 meters would be 15 feet.
15 feet? I thought it was 16.5 feet, but okay. Either way, just so that people that are on this call understand the depth associated with what you're saying.
Yeah, roughly 3 feet per meter. So yeah. So just a few discussion points, then I'll turn it over to everyone for questions, or we can keep moving through the agenda. I think we can conclude that groundwater declines drove really widespread mortality of some of these riparian trees during the most recent drought. We saw really limited impact at sites with less than 2 meters of water table decline. And so those were kind of our thumbs up happy sites. And then at sites where there's more than 5 meters of water table decline, that's where we see really widespread mortality, and we see the GDE really failing to function. And those are the sites where we might need a flood event to cause future regeneration if we want the GDEs to persist in the future. And it's worth noting that the tree root systems are one part of this equation. A lot of these sites exist at basin boundaries where there's rising groundwater. There's also some artesian features and some runoff and stuff like that. And so the observed thresholds here are likely due to changes in the hydrologic system as much as they're due to the physiology of any individual tree. And just to circle back to the comment that someone put in chat, the processes that cause the regeneration of these ecosystems are very different than the processes that cause the mortality. And so if we want some of these sites to regenerate new cottonwoods and willows in the future, we need a flood, we need a scouring event that's going to wipe away a lot of those dead sticks on the floodplain. And it's going to make a nice open sandbar with a lot of soil moisture so that those new seeds can germinate. We know a little bit from the climate models that we're going to see more droughts in the future. That could mean less precipitation or more evaporation. It could also mean fewer floods depending on how things play out. And so, this is speculative, but, one of the potentials we might see here, if we don't get floods with the same frequency that we've gotten in the past, is, maybe there will be fewer native trees and we'll see more invasives starting to fill in. And it creates the potential that these trees might not recover in the same way that we have in the past. We've seen that at the fish hatchery site right now. We haven't seen any recovery of the cottonwoods and willows. The same thing at the Sespe Confluence site, there's a lot of arundos starting to fill in there where there used to be willows. And so it creates the potential for the permanent loss of some of these riparian woodlands, if we see decreased flood prevalence in the future. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, or if we want to keep moving on the agenda, I can field emails as well.
No, Chris, this is very interesting. My question is on arundo. This is a non-native plant. And my understanding is that we want to remove as much as possible because it takes up so much groundwater that we shouldn't be doing. What is your feel on the arundo? Because my understanding is that on all sides, everyone wants to remove it. So I have a question on that. Yeah,
I'd encourage Stillwater. I think Christian's here as well. He can chime in on this. We know that the arundo is out competing the native cottonwoods and willows, and so it's going to hurt the recovery of these GDEs. There's a question as to how much groundwater arundo consumes. It's still really open up for debate. There's some early evidence that suggests that it's really good at consuming a lot of shallow soil moisture. But again, it's a big question about how much arundo consumes groundwater. We really don't know yet. So.
Well, I don't understand that because I thought it was the case that if we can clear a whole bunch of arundo, we can save 10,000 acre feet on Fox Canyon area. I've heard Candace talk to us about that. And if we just clear arundo, we can save 10,000 acre feet of water. So how do we not know that? I'm trying to understand. And I'm only asking because you don't know, but I'm an engineer at heart. And so this is like, I don't understand this data. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I
So I
appreciate
apologize.
the level of specificity there.
Yeah.
You ideally, when you're looking at something like a Rundo, you want to study it in a bunch of different systems in a bunch of different ways. And so, the data is still, I would say, pretty early. But one thing, one reason that a Rundo might be doing really well after droughts is it's really good at getting, all of the soil moisture that's available and maybe a little bit of groundwater as well. And so I think, there's still some work trying to understand, how much is a Rundo going to consume. It's bad for the GDEs in a lot of different ways, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done in understanding what role does a Rundo play in these GDEs.
Yeah, I appreciate that because from the county's perspective, we're trying to remove it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
yeah.
so I'm like, wait a minute, why would we want this non-native plant here when it's causing more trouble than good?
Yeah, it's definitely a bad thing. I think it's just a matter of how bad is it, or what number can we ascribe to its badness. And so,
well, and I don't want it to thrive then, if we're trying to build, anyway, so I could talk forever, but this is time for other people to ask questions. So directors, any questions? All right, Lisa, I see there's some chats.
Yes, we have a few questions. One says, this is interesting as far as it goes of looking at the reduction of vegetation during a drought, but I think the critical question is how much vegetation recovers after the end of a drought?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. From what we know about these species, once most of the stand is dead, you're going to need a flood, you're going to need a scouring event to get new seedlings to germinate. And so we haven't seen that sort of regeneration yet at a site like the fish hatchery or at Sespe Confluence, for example. The site at the downstream end of the basin did a little better. I don't know if we've seen new regeneration there, but there are at least some trees that survived the drought. But that is really the big question. And I think the determining factor there is going to be when are we going to get our next flood? And then how much has a Rundo taken over before that happens?
Okay. And then Patrick was curious about what is the statistical algorithm you use to get the 2 water level decline, or maybe 2 meter water level decline thresholds?
Sure, yeah.
I'm sorry, no, I said that wrong. The 2 thresholds.
Yeah. We fed the land cover data through a statistical clustering algorithm, and so we used k-means clustering. And so that's based on all of basically the satellite imagery was fed through a k-means clustering algorithm, and that produced the different classes that you saw there.
Okay. And then a comment from Dan that there's general agreement that Arundo uses a lot of water, but the ET estimates vary widely.
Yeah, and that's a good way to summarize the point that I was trying to make to Director Long.
Thank you, and I appreciate that because I'm pushing back. I play devil's advocate, and that's just my job, as I see it. Because I've gone to the fish hatchery, and it's beautiful. And so you're telling me it hasn't been grown back enough, and so I'm trying to understand because we're trying to set these parameters as to how good is good and how bad is bad. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to understand visually, it's a beautiful location. You're telling me it's not grown up enough. So where do we make these calls and make sure water gets to everybody? And we have many different people. We have ag, we have municipal, and we have to consider all the issues. So I figure because you're here, we could have that conversation. We have a lot of stakeholders that are listening, and I think it's a good point to discuss.
Yeah, I appreciate the discussion.
And then I believe Brian Bundy has a question.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Chris. Before my question, I'll just jump in on the Arundo. In Upper Ventura River, we're looking at some information, and we're scratching our head on some of the water savings estimates that have been put out there, and we're looking at the numbers, and it's not adding up. We think that well, there's a lot of questions about the numbers that have been out. We think that maybe Arundo isn't using as much groundwater as has been purported in grant applications and other things, that perhaps something else is going on with soil moisture. There was a project that was supposed to save 7,000 acre feet of water, and we can't see it in the stream hydrograph. So, and the basin's small enough that we should. So I think the jury's out on that, and hopefully we can all put our heads together and understand what's going on over time. my question for Chris is, I think you mentioned that some of these willows and others have been around since the 1800s or late 1800s, but certainly we've had droughts that have gone down to the levels that you've indicated causes widespread mortality. So I'm trying to square up those two pieces of information because they don't seem to comport. In other words, how can the trees be that old if we've gone through droughts that have declined groundwater levels to levels low enough that you're having widespread mortality?
Yeah, I'd say that the trees aren't that old, but the ecosystem is that old. And so you might have individual generations of trees that have died off during droughts, but there have been enough seeds present in the ecosystem that once you get the next flood that's going to come through, there's going to be a new generation of trees. And so the individual trees, are probably, 50 years old, or something like that. But, you're not going to have individual trees that are that old, but the ecosystem itself is persistent in that location. If you look at the comparison of the high flow events or the floods versus the droughts over the last century or so, what's happened is there's always been a pretty big flood after every drought event within a few years. And so that's the big question going forward is there going to be a longer gap between the droughts and the next big flood? And then is that going to create a window for something like a rundo to come in? And so, if the ecosystem as a whole is going to persist, if there's going to be a new generation of these cottonwoods and willows, you're going to need a big flood event, within a few years of a drought, if you want that stand to survive in the future.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, happy to.
Chair Long, I've got a question.
Please.
If I look at if I think about the area around the fish hatchery, it looks like the areas where the cottonwoods and larger willows died are more towards the north side of the river basin, closer to where the watercress operation used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I know since the 2005 flood, the main channel of the river has gone to the extreme south of the normal flood area there and away from where those stands were. Did that have an effect? As having the watercress operation go out of business and having the main channel of the river move 100 yards away to the south had an effect on those stands that you're talking about?
I've heard of the watercress operation. I haven't heard of any efforts to actually quantify empirically the relationship between those two factors. What we can say is that, the groundwater under normal conditions is very shallow all the way around the fish hatchery. And those are conditions that trees really like. And so when you have the groundwater decline as much as it did during the recent drought, 30 feet or something like that, that's going to cause a lot of stress and mortality. And so even if the channel has moved to the south, I think generally speaking, the groundwater is very shallow throughout that area. And so at least in my analysis, those are the trends that I'm looking at.
Okay, I see a couple of other factors that may be at play there, and I'm not a hydrologist, but there have been some changes where it appears that the water that may have been helping those trees has changed a bit, and the vegetation has shifted towards the south.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. Again, I don't think it's been quantified, but I appreciate the insights.
Yeah, Ed, that's a great question because the flow of the river changes through time. So,
Yeah,
are there any questions?
Those of us that farm along the river have learned that the hard way.
Just a question, is there anything else besides the groundwater that's contributing to this disease or other things that have coming in that is also playing a factor in this?
There are invasive beetles and some things like that have been documented in the basin. But I think to cause complete stand level mortality in the way that we saw, the only thing that's going to cause that level of widespread mortality is some really drastic shift in the environmental conditions there. So I think we're pretty confident in describing the trends that we observe to the groundwater declines.
Although if you looked at say the Tijuana Wash in San Diego County, you look at the Prado, behind the Prado Dam, parts of the Santa Ana River, and a few other locations where the Polypicus shothole borer has been a significant factor in populus primary, but also salix species. Be interesting to see how much of a factor that was here locally. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm not sure either, but.
Chair Long,
Yes,
I would
go
say
ahead.
from our previous, from the previous presentation we saw on future precipitation, if we have 50 inches a year, we're going to have a flood. I think the frequency of flooding, and maybe even the severity, is going to not change or maybe even increase. So I don't think you have to worry about floods in the future. Judging by the climate change prediction. So we'll get scouring and plenty of opportunity to restart.
Okay. Other questions? Anything from the chat?
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay, I just want to say, Christopher, this has been a great presentation. It's got a lot of discussion and creating a lot of thought. I appreciate Candace Milligan asking for you to be on here, and appreciate that you've been heard all of our presentations. As stakeholders go, we welcome you at any time. This is an information only, so I don't believe we need to vote on it. And so if there's any other questions, we'll move on to the next information item. Thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you, directors. I appreciate it. I was happy to share.
Very much.
Really great questions.
Super informative.
Thank you. Okay, let's just move on to the other item, which is the information, is the recharge release from Santa Felicia Dam. If you can just give us an update on that, and then we'll move back to the 4B.
Okay, very good. My name is Murray McEachran. I'm with United Water, and I'm going to cover the 2020 conservation release. And actually, I'll be covering 3 different releases, but mainly there was one that I'll be covering for the most part. Let's see. PowerPoint. Looking for. I'll try this one. No. Okay. Are you seeing a PowerPoint slide up?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And hopefully you can see my laser. Okay, so basically Santa Felicia Dam, as you know, is in the right upstream in the Piru Basin there. We have a storage capacity of about 83,000 acre feet. We're currently right around a little over 14,000 acre feet right now. So we got lots of available storage. Hopefully these storms next week will help fill that up and change those numbers around a little bit. Okay. There we go. Okay, so in summary, we had pretty much an average year. When looking at precipitation in El Rio, Santa Paula, and Lake Piru, the gray bar here shows last year's rainfall compared to the average in the blue bars. As you can see, it was just a little bit under average, and it was definitely under last year, 2019. We definitely had a wetter year. In terms of runoff in the Santa Clara River, this is a kind of a total runoff for every single year, with 2005 being the most runoff with over 1 million acre feet of water. And some of the driest on record actually were 2015, 16, and 18, talking about the recent drought that we were just in. 2020 was right about in the middle here in terms of runoff. So again, pretty average. Okay, so what water did we have in Lake Piru this year? First of all, we started with a fairly high storage at about 27,000 acre feet. We normally take that water down a little bit further, but since the previous year was fairly wet, we kept a fair amount in, and that turned out to be a really good thing. We had natural inflows of about 19,000 acre feet. We also did a water exchange with Castaic, and we did a let's see, we did a purchase from the city of Ventura of about 6,600 acre feet of state water. And then United Water also has an allocation of state water. And I think it's 75% last year was the allocation. So we got 2,363 acre feet. So this is all the water that we had to basically to play with this year. And so we started with an early release. We have not done this for at least about 30 years or so, where we actually did a release in the winter time. And the reason being is that we had some rainfall, if you remember, in December, but then we had January and February were pretty much bone dry. We got no rainfall during during that time. And we knew groundwater elevations were still fairly high. So we decided, well, we might as well release the water while groundwater elevations are high. We'll be able to get some down to the Freeman diversion, and of course, get some into the Piru and Fillmore basins at the same time. And so we started that conservation release at the very end of February, and then turned out, sure enough, beginning of March, we started to get some big storms coming in. So we turned off this release. And then we allowed the lake to fill up again. We did one thing called a migration release. And I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but we have a FERC license. And part of those conditions is to provide migration flows for steelhead to provide access into Piru Creek, basically when this whole river system is running. And we have certain conditions based on a gauge up here in LA County of when we need to do these migration releases. So we had one of those too that was during the peak of the storm in April. So then also we have an agreement with a group called the Downstream Water Users with DWR. And in this agreement, basically they hold on, DWR holds onto the flood flows that come into Castaic Lake. Meaning, so whenever flows are up over 100 CFS coming into Castaic Lake, we ask them to hold that water so that it doesn't rush off to the ocean, basically. And then we release it in a controlled manner where we're able to percolate that water downstream. And so this year, we only had, it was about 4,384 acre feet of this flood flow water, of which almost all of it ended up percolating in the Piru Basin. Some of it percolated upstream in the LA County area. This program, actually, we've been doing this for quite some time, and it's been very successful. There's been years, for example, 2011, I think we had 12,000 acre feet of this flood flow water. 2010, we had another 10,000 acre feet. And almost all of that, in fact, all of it ends up percolating into the Piru Basin right up there. In fact, it ends up percolating, it usually barely makes it past Torrey Road, and almost all of it ends up right upstream of the Torrey Bridge area. And of course, makes its way on downstream afterwards. So during
Marie,
go ahead.
can I ask a question? Is that separate from Schedule A water that we can purchase?
Yeah, this is not purchased water. This is just an agreement we made after they built Castaic Lake with DWR to have them increase the benefit of the natural water that comes down in this watershed.
Thank you. I just think that's important to clarify.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just kind of show you conditions in the Piru Basin. This goes back to 2007. And this is a well that's at the end of Powell Road in the Piru Basin. It's fairly close to the river. It's right near the outside of the floodplain right there. And you can see water levels respond very nicely between the Castaic flood flows and our releases from Lake Piru. You can see these immediate shots up are our releases from Lake Piru, and then usually these more gradual releases from Castaic flood flows, they just end up a little bit more gradual because most of it's percolating upstream of where this actual well is right here. Going into 2011, as Christopher was talking about the GDEs, conditions were very good here. Then, of course, as you know, it stopped raining. We had a fair amount of stored water for 2012 to do another release out of our lake. And as you can see, water levels went up. But then after that, basically, we got barely any inflows into our lake for quite a few years here. So we were unable to do any releases. There were no Castaic flood flow releases until 2017. Then that year we had a pretty good year where we had quite a few Castaic flood flows. We also purchased 10,000 acre feet of Article 21 water, where we released that out of Castaic this time, and all of it ended up into the Piru Basin during that year. And then also we had another release out of Lake Piru where water level shot up. And then again, we went into 2018, another dry year, 2019, a decent year. Then here we are into this year right in here. Basically, what I want to point out is right now, conditions, let me go back one, fairly well recovered back to our normal highs, which were during a fairly wet period here in the 2000s. So we're back into those conditions again right now.
Marie, can I ask you, it looks like you've got a 4-year difference between going into the drought and then coming back out, maybe a little bit longer. So before 2007, was there a similar pattern?
Oh yeah, there's been quite a few droughts that even have taken it quite a bit lower, actually. If you look back into the late 30s or mid 30s actually, and then the 40s and then the 50s, there are droughts that actually went below this water level that I'm showing you right here.
Thank you.
And you know, miraculously, this basin recovers. You know, it's all it takes is one good wet year, and the thing fills up. So it's always nice to watch these hydrographs in this basin. Okay, so our larger release out of Lake Piru occurred. We started in August. Wait, June, July. Oh shoot, I don't remember. Yeah, I'll show you in just a minute. But basically, conditions releasing across the Piru Basin here. This is what it looks like typically before we start our release. It's a big, wide, open, sandy channel, and some of our releases, as we start the release, goes almost to that exact same width. And as a result, as you can imagine, it percolates a heck of a lot of water in this reach during that time. And usually what happens after you release for a longer and longer period of time, it begins to cut channels where this floodway is not as wide. It actually narrows up, even though it's the same amount of discharge. This past year, actually, our channel was not quite as wide, and this is more what it looked like. So it wasn't, so we didn't have this whole area for it to percolate in. So we didn't get quite as much percolation as we have in the past. This is some pictures of the release. This is making its way down through the Piru Basin, looking upstream. Here we are in the Fillmore. This is released water from the near the fish hatchery, actually. And so this is what our release looked like. This is how much water we released out of Santa Felicia Dam. So we start out at 100, we leveled off for a while. We eventually worked our way up to a little over 250, almost up to 275, and then we worked our way back down again. And I'll explain what we were doing here. It wasn't that, this was actually a very controlled thing that we were doing. And this line right here, so what we do is when we do our releases, we actually measure at the rising groundwater at each basin boundary. So we figure out how much water is percolating into each basin. So if you look at the area, this dark blue area, this is how much water during that time was percolating into the Piru Basin, right? And this is how much water was making it past the Piru Basin right here. So then again, we measure down by the near Santa Paula at the bottom end of the Fillmore Basin, and this is how much water is percolating in the Fillmore Basin right here. And again, this is what makes it past the Fillmore Basin and makes it on its way down to both the Santa Paula Basin. To a lesser degree, water percolates into there, and then what's diverted at the Freeman diversion. So in summary, if you look at this, you know, for example, on this day right here, we were releasing 275 CFS. About a little less than 150 of it was making it past the Piru Basin. And at the Freeman diversion, we were only getting about 75 CFS of the 275 being released. And so what happens is that channel cuts, we start getting a higher efficiency. And also as water levels begin to rise in both the basins, we get more and more water down to the Freeman diversion. Eventually we started seeing it go up, and this year we were limited. We were trying to keep our diversions at 100 CFS at the Freeman. And the reason being is that we had some environmental restrictions downstream where we couldn't exceed that. Otherwise, we're going to get into kind of trouble, and I'll explain that in a minute. So what we did is we reduced our releases in order to maintain about 100 CFS at the Freeman diversion. And in doing that, that allowed us to release actually for about 3 months. So we started on August 6th and we finished in November, in November, basically. So we released for about a 3-month period, which is one of the longest releases we've ever done. Because normally we release at a much higher rate, usually around 300-400 CFS for the entire period. And as a result, you run out of time or run out of volume, and then you end up with a shorter release. Okay, so in summary, let's talk about how much water went into each basin during this release. We released a total of 33,000 acre feet. And by measuring it again at the Piru Basin, we found that 14,500 acre feet of that water went into the Piru Basin. Oops, and then about 6,300 went into the Fillmore Basin, and about 1,000 went into the Santa Paula Basin, and then we diverted about 11,600. So if you do the math, roughly both Fillmore and Piru got about 62%, I think is what I calced out, of the total release. And that's actually fairly close to average. If you're looking at a long-term average of how much water does the Piru release actually benefit the Fillmore and Piru basins, it's right around 60% or so of the water is released. Let's see. So looking at our lake levels, this is the storage actually of Santa Felicia or Lake Piru from 1990 all the way to present. As you can see, our yield of the dam really is to lower it down as much as possible and to be able to capture as much winter runoff as possible when the flows are really high, and then we release it in a controlled manner so it benefits all the basins. And that's the way, Lake Piru goes up and down like crazy, throughout the years. And of course, here you're going to look at, here we started you remember I talked about 2011 was our last good wet year. 2012, we did a decent sized release, but that was it. We got no more inflows. So there's no more going up, if you notice, and it kept on, it didn't go up at all until finally in 2017, then 2019, and then again in 20. So we've had a little bit of a recovery there.
Murray, 2017 was the purchase as well, right?
Okay, so 2017 we purchased the Article 21 water, but that went through Castaic. And then in 2019 we purchased additional Article 21 water, and that went through our Lake Piru, of which we released downstream down to the Freeman diversion, of which the Fox Canyon GMA actually ended up purchasing and first spreading.
That was in 2019 when you did that release.
Right, so that was in this release right here. That was part of that 15,000.
So the 2017 wouldn't show up because it didn't go through Lake Piru.
Exactly, yeah.
Good question. Anyone else have any questions as we just had it? No? Okay, keep going.
Okay, so looking at down at the Freeman diversion. Okay, so I mentioned that we had to keep our diversions right around at 100 or below, and part of the reason is that there was concerns that we could have Omicus down in our area, down by the Freeman Diversion, and therefore the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries didn't want us to do any flushes. So the way we used to deal with all the algae that comes down with the release and all the different sediment that comes down with the release is we open up a roller gate here, we flush it out for an hour, and it goes downstream, and then we turn it back on again and we start diverting again. Well, in 2019, they didn't want us to do any of those flushes because there could be an Omicus, a trout, basically, in this water, and if we sent it downstream, it could die. So as a result, we got caught up with a lot of hair algae. That messed us up for quite a while. And then also we ended up taking in the bed load, meaning all the sands that travel with this release. So this year, learning from that, conditions didn't change. We had a solution this year, and this was it right here. So it's a dredge actually. So this year what we did, and this was a very human intensive operation actually to be able to achieve this. But basically we had to create what were called an isolation zone upstream of the Freeman Diversion where the sands accumulate before they go into our diversion. So what we do is we separated this out, made sure that there are no fish in this netted area. We expand it out, and then we can have this dredge actually go back and forth and dredge out all this sand. And the reason why we had to keep it at 100, if we brought it over that, there's no way we could have created this isolation zone, and also it would have started bringing in the sands a whole lot faster where we couldn't have kept up with it. So as a result, it worked. It did take a lot of man hours, but it did work, and we did get a fair amount down to the Freeman Diversion. We spread about almost 2,000 acre feet in Satakoy. El Rio got about 6,000 acre feet. And because we were releasing for such a long period of time, for the 3 months, we're actually able to get a lot out to our surface water deliveries that offset pumping along the closer out to the coastline. So this is actually a very high valued water in achieving our mission. And with that, I was going to end with a video if it works. Let's see. I can make no guarantee. No, wait. That's the reason why I end with them. I typically never put them in presentations because they never work. The video has stopped. No, anyway, it was just kind of a PR thing showing the dredging and stuff, but it's gone.
Well, Murray, thank you so much. I see the dredging that we do out off of Port of Hueneme to get sand and everything. It's a complicated situation and really do appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions for Murray on this item? Any other questions? I don't see any comments. Any director questions? Well, Murray, you've stumped us all.
All right.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, got lucky.
Really do appreciate this. Yeah, thank you. I agree with Christina. Just thank you for the information going on with the water flow. It's important for us to know what is actual versus what we purchase and how it affects the basins and how quickly our basins recharge. I think that's really an important factor for us when we're determining everything. So with that, if there's no further questions, information item only, so we don't need to vote on that. Thank you so much. And we will move on to the last item, which is our monitoring well project.
Okay, I will make this brief. I think I can go pretty quick without missing much content here. Okay, am I in full screen mode now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And we're seeing
I can see your next slide.
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter's view.
There you go.
How do I turn that off?
If you go to display settings and then switch the two.
Good?
There we are.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
Christopher.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, recall, we're trying to prioritize how to use our monitoring well monies where we received a DWR grant. And this first slide is characterizing the data gaps assessment for based on a previous work product from Daniel B. Stevens and Associates. Tim Moore was involved in this, and recognizing areas in our 3 principal aquifer zones where we have gaps in our monitoring information. So in the Western Fillmore Basin, that's an area where we all agree we would like to have a nested monitoring site where we would get drill one large bore and put in several wells that are screened separately and isolated with clays. And so we can get at the same location in one boring water level and water quality information from multiple aquifers.
Excuse me, Dan. So, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry to interrupt, but in the view, the PowerPoint presentation slide is cut off, and so I'm not sure if everybody's able to read the text, and we got one comment to that effect.
Which part's cut off?
The left part.
The left. Okay, do you see the entire image?
No, we can't see the left.
Okay.
And feel free to weigh in if others are seeing something
It's
different.
the wording. There you go. So we
Okay,
couldn't read the wording.
Should I do it in this mode? Is that better?
Yes.
I think that works.
That works.
Okay, so basically these numbered sites are priority sites for zone A. That's our shallowest zone, and you've heard a fair bit of discussion today about most people don't drill very shallow wells. They are the ones we may be most concerned about dewatering, but we have generally, many people don't drill a well only 120 feet deep. And so our thought process was that's our biggest data gap, is that shallow system, as Chris was talking about, and Tony and others. And so we said, maybe we don't need 2 deep wells, maybe we need 1 deep well and a number of shallow wells that we can do with probably a hollow stem auger and not a mud rotary rig. And so what we wanted to do is look at some of these sites, and once we identified areas where we'd like to infill water level records based on locality and a lack of information, we're saying, well, let's look and see if there's existing targets there that we aren't currently monitoring. So if we can avoid drilling a new well and rely on existing well, we'd like to do that. And so a couple of slides here are showing those areas. So this is, probably the colors aren't very good, but this is showing some existing targets where we identified appropriate screen intervals and compared to our intended new well areas. And so the remaining slides are just investigating a couple of these examples. So this is that area near the Santa Paula Basin boundary. We did not see existing candidates for good wells. There is one fairly recently drilled well to 410 feet, and we've retrieved the paper e-log for that well, so that's going to help us anticipate what we'll see when we go in and drill our new well in that vicinity. This is Balcom Ditch here, and the Santa Paula Basin boundary is just off the map. This is the area that Chris Kibler was describing. This is the fish hatchery here. You can see the races. This is the so-called Cespi Cienega site. That's the restoration area. And we don't have any shallow wells in this vicinity. This is the basin boundary between Piru and Fillmore, and this is one of our targets for a new shallow monitoring well, so we can really see what's going on in that shallow flow system, whereas existing wells are all deeper. Another target location is, this is the Bardsdale area. This is the Sespe Creek and the confluence with the Santa Clara River right on the left of the image. And Bardsdale, this is one of our key wells. So we would like to see if we can get additional information out of this well where we have a long-term record of monthly manual measurements. And to outfit that well, this is what that small production well looks like. It has an existing 3/4 inch access plug. Our pressure transducers are 7/8 inch diameter. So what we would have to do to modify this wellhead, this is a submersible pump well, is go and tap that hole, that existing access hole, out to a 1 inch diameter, and then we can drop a pressure transducer down that existing well. So we've spoken with that landowner. They appear to be willing to let us make that wellhead modification. And so we're hopeful that we won't have to drill a new well in this vicinity.
Right.
Moving upstream, here is Piru Creek, and this is the Rancho Camulos area, and then Blue Cut is just off the map. These are also a couple existing shallow wells. They do not have any wellhead access, so we're trying to get a hold of the well owner there to see if he'd be amenable to wellhead modifications. And again, this would just be drilling a hole in the cover plate here so we can get into that well either with a manual dip or a pressure transducer. Remember, this is the area where we see a lot of groundwater recharge and shallow groundwater before the water spills into the basin or adds to the groundwater system there. So we don't think the water levels here are going to be very dynamic. So we could probably get the information we need to confirm our conceptual model in this area with just manual reads and not necessarily have to put a transducer in that well. Moving on to our next area of interest, this is the Bear Creek area. This is Highway 126 and Sespe Creek's just off the map. This is an area where we did not identify any shallow well targets and will likely be approaching some landowners to drill a new well. Our friends at the Nature Conservancy have worked with us in the past for monitoring well sites in the Oxnard forebay. We're hopeful they'd be a friendly landowner where we could have a fairly streamlined access agreement to install a new monitoring well, because a lot of this effort is the coordination with the landowner and the easements. And if we have a friendly that wants to use this information as well, sometimes that can really streamline our process. So it may be on the north side of the river here. There's of course concerns about drilling in the riparian areas and the bird habitats and the nesting season and all that, but some of these slides show TNC Holdings as they own significant lands in these areas. Our next target here is in lower Piru Creek. So Lake Piru is here. You know, following our basin boundary modifications, the Piru Basin extends up lower Piru Creek up here. This was an area where we wanted additional information. We don't have any monitoring in this part of the basin. There is, in this case, an existing production well. And again, the landowner seems willing to let us measure this well. It's very shallow. It's only about 47 feet. That's typical for the shallow alluvium in this part of the basin. The pump's set at 20 feet here. So shallow, stable groundwater. That's a surprisingly shallow completion for a well. Okay, our next target area is lower Sespe Creek. You can see the train tracks crossing Sespe Creek here, the city of Fillmore, 126, where we have a target existing well a little upstream of our target location near the confluence, but we're also talking with that landowner. Again, it's a small submersible pump, 92 feet deep, recased in 1997, excuse me. So, and in this case, the landowner says he's willing to allow us to make wellhead modifications to instrument this site. Okay, and then here, this is the county line area in eastern Piru Basin. This is Newhall Properties, or now 5 Point, I believe. And this is the, traditionally we map the head of the basin. In this vicinity, this is an area very shallow alluvium where the blue cut gauge is here, and it's really the natural hydrologic divide between the Eastern Basin and the Piru Basin, but the new basin boundaries don't quite conform to the county boundary, as was probably the intention of DWR. So we're wondering if we need to install a well in this vicinity just to cover the very head of the basin. But again, this is an area where we expect to have very stable shallow groundwater levels. So there may not be a lot of value in installing a well in that vicinity. Okay, and just in summary, so we do think we have some rich targets for existing wells. We will have to drill wells to fill those data gaps in other areas, but we just wanted to present the approach to the directors here and share our thinking that we think more valuable information would come from more shallow wells than too deep wells at the basin boundaries.
Dan, could you do me a favor for Director Villaseñor? What was our budget? What was our initial budget with that we submitted to DWR?
The Tonys can help me here. I think it's $800,000.
$800,000 to install
Yes.
2 wells, right?
That's correct. And the DWR grant is providing 75% of that. So this is a highly unusual 75% state, 25% local. So it's almost a deal you can't refuse. So so this is something we would like to honor the state's offer and get the maximum benefit we can out of this project.
But if we don't need to drill wells because we can utilize other wells, we would prefer that, correct?
Yes, or we can
Correct.
move on to other target areas and do more infill in perhaps deeper zones.
Okay, and also just for our understanding, we were talking about rates in which our GSP collects, and we are trying to get down lower to of the 12 per foot. We are trying to get as low as possible, but we have to pay for the GSP. And so just so you know that, we don't want to drill just to drill because we said we were going to. We want to be definitely strategic in where we place it and what we do. Dan's smiling. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I would comment that these monitoring wells help fill some information gaps, but clearly they won't be gathering any data or providing anything that helps us with our first plans preparation. That's all data that's been collected already, but the SGMA requires us to update our plans every 5 years. And so these are areas that we have identified in which we do not have the greatest of information. And so the purpose of these would be to, as Dan said, the highest value target areas to provide us information in the future. So when we update our plans, we can do a more accurate and a better job with those plans. So they would be constructed this coming summer if we're able to site these and put into service immediately, and then they would be collecting data for several years that could inform our next plan updates.
So are there any additional comments or recommendations from our directors?
Dan, let's talk offline. I may have some ideas for Bardsdale for you.
Great, thank
Cool.
you.
I love these connections. Anything from our public on this item? Okay, so then the recommendation is to receive this report and to continue work in this area. And I believe, correct? So with that, I would ask to
Director,
some more slides.
Director
Go
Long?
ahead, Tony.
Just quickly, I realized that the hour is getting late, but I thought the board might be interested in seeing a summary of the estimated monitoring well costs that we got from our preliminary bids from the drilling contractors. Remember that the idea of getting these preliminary bids was to give us a better idea of how many wells could we afford to drill potentially. And so we've gotten a few bids in, we've clustered them up. And so if we're drilling one dual completion, that's the deep nested well we were talking about, and 7 monitoring wells. That was the original concept. So you've got different bids here. And so the most expensive one, including all estimates for easements, contingencies, construction oversight, preparing specifications for drilling, we're looking at maybe 700,000 kind of number. So we have adequate funds here to do what we want to do for the 7 monitoring wells, and possibly a little bit more if we want to go down that path. So I just wanted you to rest assured that we've got adequate money in the budget, in the grant budget, to do what we think we need to do here. And we'll refine these costs once we go out to bid formally to the contractors, and then we'll come back and refresh this set of information for you. The timeline looks something like this. So our goal is to get specifications that will be ready for submittal to the contractors, and work with agency counsel on whatever those specifications, or excuse me, actually the contract terms should look like. Bring it to you next month for your acceptance of that request for quotations, and then get it out on the street while the contractors can do their thing, and get bids back by, let's say, middle of March if everything goes like clockwork. And so the goal is to get us to a point where we're actually doing installation in, let's say, late May kind of time frame through the early fall. And the goal is to get these things done before the end of the calendar year. But as the schedule says right here, the end of September-ish, we're looking at being able to complete the program. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what the schedule would look like, and that hopefully next board meeting, we'll come back to you with an agenda item that will talk about your approval of releasing the request for bids to the contractors.
So we'll be approving the contract that's chosen and the budget associated with that.
You'll be approving the bid specifications that will go out to the contractors for them to submit a bid. And then we'll come back to you once we get those collected with recommendations for a contractor to select.
Okay, so it looks like, to me, you have your bid evaluations done by 3/31. So you're saying the contractor selection will be on 4/14/15, which would be the meeting following that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's the idea. In April, then we make a selection. During that time frame, we've been working on easements and getting that all squared away, and then we'll be into permitting right after we select the contractor.
Don't you have to get our approval for purchasing any easements or going into any contract for any easements?
Hopefully, yes, and hopefully that's occurring. The construction of the easement terms are occurring here, and negotiations are occurring here, and that would be something that could come to the board at that same April meeting if that's appropriate. And Mr. Emmert can weigh in on that, whether that timeline looks reasonable for easement purposes.
It's good enough for talking purposes now. Needless to say, that's a major focus of attention, is to get these sites nailed down and get these easement documents back to you.
Yeah, I would expect, Madam Chair, that we would be involved in, drafting the easements, the general terms and conditions and the specs, but we'll also have CEQA issues to deal with as well.
That's what I'm thinking. It sounds really great, but nothing in government has ever gone to the time-wise I would like. So I had a question on that.
You were, sorry, you were saying you wanted to aim to have everything done by the end of the year, but it's looking like end of September. So following Madam Chairperson's information about how long things take in government, does that give a little leeway then, is my question.
That's the goal, is that by end of September then gives us a couple of months leeway before the end of the year, when we have to have the money spent, as I understand it, by the end of the calendar year.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Good question. We need to spend it before the end of the calendar year, but we also need all these reports as well. So are the same people doing this work as doing all the other report work, or no?
It's a hybrid on some of this stuff. United is doing some of the efforts on the well construction project. We're doing some of it. So it's a little bit of a hybrid.
Okay. Did we answer the question in the chat, Lisa?
Yeah, I think it was just an FYI to account for a CEQA in the schedule, even if you only need a notice of exemption.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. All right. So this is information, right?
Yes.
Good to know. Directors, any other questions? So this is a motion. I need a motion to receive and file and to request everyone move forward.
So moved.
All right, I'll take Mr. McFadden as a first and Mr. Kimball as Director Kimball as a second. Any further discussion? Eva, roll call.
Director Kimball,
Aye.
Chair Long,
Aye.
Vice Chair McFadden,
Aye.
Director Pace,
He's there.
Director Villaseñor.
Aye.
Okay, that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Next up is the future topics of the board. I apologize tremendously for coming in late. I was chairing the EDC collaborative. And I should have noticed on the board meeting that I didn't know that City of Fillmore was going to have a representative today. I've asked Mr. O'Neill to work with Mr. Emmerich in regards to swearing in. There's a process that goes on and we have an official, yay, you're sworn in, that I think we should be doing. And then the question is the timeliness and making sure that all of our representatives are sworn in, whatever that realm is. And then your chair and vice chair, all that. I mean, we're kind of a working engine, but we do need to do those processes based on our bylaws. So I want to make sure we follow suit on that.
Agreed. Yes.
Okay. Is there any other future agenda topics that this board would like to discuss?
Sure.
Yes.
I have a few more questions for Christopher Kibler. I know we're out of order here. Should I do that offline or?
Just go ahead.
Okay. Question. I'm thinking about the Sespe Cienega site and your comments about the vegetation. Black cottonwood roots, I understand, are could go down 5 to 6 meters. Is that?
Most of the root mass is going to be around 1 meter. There are tap roots that can go down probably 3 to 5, I would say.
Okay.
And I don't know if Christian is still on the line. He's also pretty familiar with the vegetation.
And then just trying to understand the arundo. I understand that most of the roots are also surface fibrous roots, but they can have roots that can tap water down to 5 meters.
I'm less familiar with the arundo root systems. I know one of the challenges with the spreading of arundo is that fragments from the root systems can spread across the basin and then establish a new stand of arundo, but I'm not sure about the depth of those root systems.
I guess what I'm trying to do is understand. I'm looking at a imagery from that site from 2019, and it's obvious that the arundo is doing great. And
yeah.
As a farmer, we hate arundo. But I'm curious to know why two plants that have actually similar root systems, why the arundo is taking over and why the black poplar is not. It's not coming back.
Yeah, the working understanding is that a lot of the cottonwoods or the poplars died off, and there just hasn't been flood events to cause new seedlings to germinate. And arundo is very good, can use soil moisture very efficiently. And so the idea is that arundo thrives better under these conditions where, there hasn't been the right conditions for these willows and these cottonwoods to regenerate, but arundo can thrive in those conditions and can establish very easily. Doesn't need a scouring event to set up a new stand.
Although both the popular and willow species have aerially dispersed seeds that just go all over the place.
Yeah, you need the soil moisture for them to germinate, and then also you need an exposed sandbar basically, so that they can establish. They get outcompeted really easily by other vegetation, so that's why you need the scouring event from the flood.
Chair Long, I could probably go on and on with questions because it's fascinating to me, but I'll spare the rest of the board and figure out how to do it offline.
Well, and also I agree, it's a good one for future discussions as we're needing to understand the GDEs. I was in a DWR training and they were talking about GWEs, and the concern was at the root base of 30 feet, not 15 feet or so forth. So I think we need a little bit more discussion on that as to the 6 parameters in which we're watching, and then how do we make those decisions based on what DWR has requested us to do for Sigma. There's wants, there's needs, there's desires. I just want to make sure we continue this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to help.
Any other future discussion questions? If not, I really appreciate everyone's time here tonight. There's been some great discussions and knowledge shared by all. And our next regular meeting is on February 19th. So until then, if we don't see you in Zoom land, I'll probably see you at the next meeting. Thank you so much. Appreciate everyone's time. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.